Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Kenneth Young, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Blood Mountain, deep in Georgia's Chattahoochee National Forest, during what was supposed to be a simple 3-day camping trip with my best friend Marcus. Marcus Thompson had been my closest friend since college, and we'd made it a tradition to escape into the wilderness every fall when the leaves turned. This year, he'd suggested Blood Mountain, Georgia's highest peak on the Appalachian Trail. "It'll be perfect," he'd said over beers at O'Malley's. "Remote enough that we won't see another soul for days." I should have paid attention to the way he emphasized that last part. We'd driven up from Atlanta on a crisp October morning, the kind where your breath fogs and the air tastes like copper pennies and dying leaves. The drive to Neal's Gap took us through increasingly remote territory, past Dahlonega with its tourist traps, through winding mountain roads where cell towers became sparse, then non-existent. By the time we reached the trailhead parking lot, my phone showed no signal. "Good," Marcus had said, shouldering his pack. "No distractions." The first day's hike to our planned campsite near Blood Mountain's summit was brutal. The trail carved through dense hardwood forest that seemed to swallow sound, creating a cathedral silence broken only by our labored breathing and the crunch of leaves underfoot. Ancient oaks and maples towered overhead, their canopy so thick that even in broad daylight, the forest floor remained dim and shadow-crossed. Marcus had always been the stronger hiker, but I noticed he kept checking over his shoulder, scanning the tree line with an intensity that made my skin crawl. When I asked about it, he just shrugged and said the wilderness made him feel observed. We made camp in a small clearing about a quarter-mile off the main trail, near a spring that bubbled up from between moss-covered rocks. The water tasted clean and cold, but there was something about the way it reflected our faces, distorted, wavering, like we were looking at ourselves from the bottom of a deep well. That first night passed without incident, though I woke several times to the sound of branches snapping in the distance. Each time, I'd listen for footsteps or voices, but heard only the wind sighing through the trees and the distant hoot of an owl. It was the second day when things began to feel wrong. We'd planned to summit Blood Mountain before noon, then explore some of the old Cherokee trails that webbed through the surrounding wilderness. Marcus had brought photocopied maps from some obscure hiking guide, hand-drawn sketches that showed paths not marked on any official Forest Service materials. "Found these at an estate sale," he'd explained, unfolding the yellowed paper. "Old Cherokee hunting trails. The seller said his grandfather used them back in the 1920s. The trails existed, all right. We found the first one exactly where the map indicated, a narrow deer path that wound through rhododendron thickets and around massive granite outcroppings. But something about walking those paths felt like trespassing, like we were following routes meant for feet other than ours. The wrongness started small. My compass began spinning wildly whenever we stopped to check direction. Marcus's GPS unit showed our location jumping erratically, sometimes placing us miles away, sometimes showing us as standing in empty space where no land should exist. "Electronics," Marcus muttered, but his voice carried a tremor I'd never heard before. Then there were the sounds. Footsteps that seemed to mirror our own, always just out of sync, always just far enough away that we couldn't pinpoint their location. When we stopped, they stopped. When we walked, they followed. "Echo," I said, but even as the word left my mouth, I knew it wasn't true. Echoes don't precede the original sound. By late afternoon, we'd hiked deeper into the wilderness than either of us had intended. The hand-drawn map showed a shortcut back to camp, a trail that supposedly connected to the Appalachian Trail about 2 miles south of our clearing. But when we tried to follow it, the path seemed to shift beneath our feet. I know how that sounds, but I swear the trail changed direction when we weren't looking directly at it. We'd be walking north, following a clear path through the trees, and then suddenly we'd find ourselves heading east with no memory of turning. "The sun's wrong," Marcus said, stopping so abruptly I nearly collided with him. He was right. The sun hung low in the sky, but it was positioned where it should have been in the morning, not late afternoon. Either we'd been hiking for 12 hours without realizing it, or something was very wrong with our perception of time. "We need to get back to camp," I said, fighting down the panic that clawed at my throat. Marcus nodded, but his eyes had gone wide and glassy. He kept staring at something over my shoulder, something I couldn't see no matter how quickly I turned around. We tried to retrace our steps, but the forest had become a maze. Every tree looked the same. Every boulder, every stream crossing, every fallen log seemed identical to the last. The temperature dropped as shadows lengthened, and our breath began to fog, even though it had been warm all day. That's when we heard the singing. It drifted through the trees like smoke, a wordless melody that seemed to come from all directions at once. The voice was human but wrong, too high in some places, too low in others, like someone trying to imitate singing without understanding how voices work. Marcus grabbed my arm. His fingers dug in so hard I knew there would be bruises. "We have to go," he whispered. "We have to go right now." But we couldn't go anywhere. Every direction looked the same, and the singing was getting closer. That's when I saw the figure between the trees. It stood about 50 yards away, perfectly still, watching us. At first glance, it looked like a person, tall, thin, wearing dark clothing. But something about its proportions was off. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an angle that would break a human neck. "Don't look at it," Marcus hissed, but I couldn't look away. The figure raised one impossibly long arm and waved. The gesture was perfectly normal, perfectly human, but it made every hair on my body stand on end. Then it smiled, and I saw that its mouth was full of too many teeth. I don't remember running. One moment we were standing frozen in terror, the next we were crashing through underbrush, branches tearing at our clothes and skin. Behind us, the singing continued, now joined by laughter that sounded like breaking glass. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs gave out, finally collapsing beside a stream I didn't recognize. The water was black and still, reflecting nothing but empty sky. "What was that?" I gasped. Marcus was shaking so hard his teeth chattered. "Cherokee stories," he whispered. "My grandmother used to tell them. Things that wear human faces but aren't human. Skinwalkers. But they're supposed to be Navajo, not Cherokee. There's no such thing." "Then what did we just see?" His voice cracked. "What's been following us all day?" I didn't have an answer. I couldn't have an answer, because the alternative was madness. We followed the stream until it led to a larger creek, then followed that until we found a trail marker. By the time we stumbled back into our camp, full darkness had fallen and our fire had burned down to cold ashes. "How long were we gone?" I asked, checking my watch. But the digital display showed only random numbers, sometimes 3:47, sometimes 11:23, sometimes symbols that weren't numbers at all. Marcus was already gathering our gear with frantic efficiency. "We're leaving, tonight, right now." "We can't hike in the dark. We can't stay here." He grabbed my shoulders, his eyes wild in the dim starlight. "It knows where we are. It followed us back." I wanted to argue, but something made me look toward the tree line. In the darkness between the trees, pale shapes moved with fluid, inhuman grace. Watching, waiting. We packed by the light of our headlamps, throwing gear into our packs with shaking hands. Every few seconds, one of us would turn toward a sound. A snapping branch, a rustle of leaves, the soft whisper of footsteps on moss. As we prepared to leave, Marcus stopped suddenly. "Listen," he whispered. From somewhere in the darkness came the sound of singing. The same wordless melody we'd heard earlier, but now it was coming from multiple voices, creating harmonies that hurt to hear. "There's more than one," Marcus breathed. We shouldered our packs and started toward the trail that would lead us back to the parking lot. But after only a few hundred yards, Marcus stopped again. "The trail's gone," he said. He was right. Where the clear, well-marked path should have been, there was only dense forest. No white blazes on the trees, no worn dirt track, no indication that humans had ever passed this way. "This is wrong," I said, though the words felt inadequate. "Trails don't just disappear." Marcus pulled out his headlamp and swept it across the ground. In the cone of LED light, I could see our own footprints in the soft earth, but they led in a circle, ending where we now stood. "We never left camp," he whispered. "We've been walking in circles." That's when I noticed our tent was still standing exactly where we'd left it. Our sleeping bags were still rolled out inside. The cold ashes of our fire sat undisturbed in the ring of stones. But we'd packed everything. I remembered stuffing my sleeping bag into its compression sack, watched Marcus collapse the tent poles. I could still feel the weight of my pack on my shoulders. I looked down. My pack was gone. So was Marcus's. "This isn't real," I said, but my voice sounded distant, like it was coming from someone else's mouth. "This can't be real." The singing grew louder, and now I could make out shapes moving between the trees. Tall, pale figures that walked upright but moved wrong like marionettes controlled by a drunk puppeteer. "They're playing with us," Marcus said. His voice had gone flat, emotionless. "They're playing with time." One of the figures stepped into our clearing. In the fading light of our fire, I could see it clearly for the first time. It wore Marcus's face. Not a mask or disguise, it was perfectly exactly Marcus, down to the small scar on his chin from a childhood accident and the way his left eye squinted slightly when he was afraid. But it was wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. The smile was too wide. The eyes blinked horizontally instead of vertically. When it moved, its joints bent in directions human joints shouldn't bend. "Hello, Kenneth," it said in Marcus's voice, but the words came out slightly ahead of its mouth movements like a badly dubbed movie. I looked at the real Marcus standing beside me. His face had gone white as bone. "That's not me," he whispered. The thing wearing Marcus's face tilted its head. "Isn't it? Are you sure?" More figures emerged from the tree line. They all wore familiar faces. Marcus's face repeated over and over with slight variations. Some were taller, some shorter. Some had different hair, different clothes, but they were all unmistakably him. "Which one is real?" the first one asked, its voice like wind through dry leaves. "Can you tell the difference?" I grabbed Marcus's arm, the real Marcus, I hoped, and felt solid flesh and bone. But when I looked at him, doubt crept into my mind. Was his scar on the right side of his chin or the left? Had his eyes always been that shade of brown? "Kenneth," he said, but his voice sounded exactly like all the others. The duplicates began to laugh, a sound like grinding glass. They moved closer, forming a circle around us. In the dancing shadows cast by our dying fire, I couldn't tell which one was real anymore. They all looked like Marcus. They all sounded like Marcus. They all knew things only Marcus should know. "Remember freshman year?" one of them said. "When you threw up in Professor Hamilton's wastebasket?" "Your first girlfriend, Sarah Mitchell," said another. "You never told anyone about the night you cried when she broke up with you." "The scar on your knee from when you fell off your bike at age 7, added a third. "You told everyone you got it in a fight." Only Marcus knew those things. But which one was telling the truth? I backed toward the fire, grabbing a burning branch as a makeshift torch. The flames cast wild shadows, making the Marcus things look even more wrong. In the firelight, I could see that their skin was too pale, almost translucent, with dark veins visible underneath. "Stay back," I shouted, waving the torch. They laughed again, but this time the sound came from all around us, from the trees, from the ground, from the air itself. "Fire won't help," said the nearest one. "We're not afraid of fire." To prove its point, it reached out and grabbed my torch. Its skin sizzled and burned, filling the air with the smell of cooking meat, but it didn't flinch or pull away. When it released the branch, its hand was charred black, bones visible through melted flesh. But it was still smiling Marcus's smile. "We're not afraid of anything," it said. "We're already dead." That's when the real Marcus, or the one I hoped was real, grabbed my shoulder. "The stream," he whispered. "Cherokee stories say they can't cross running water." We ran toward the stream we'd found earlier, the Marcus things loping after us with their wrong, boneless gait. Behind us, their laughter echoed through the forest, joined by new voices. My own voice, calling my name from a dozen different directions. The stream was exactly where we'd left it, black water reflecting nothing. Without hesitation, Marcus plunged into the knee-deep current. I followed, gasping as the ice-cold water soaked through my boots and jeans. The Marcus things stopped at the water's edge, their identical faces twisted with frustration. But they didn't try to follow us across. "It worked," I breathed. Marcus nodded, but his face was grim. "For now. But we can't stay in the water forever." The other side of the stream looked different somehow. Darker, more oppressive. The trees were wrong, twisted into shapes that hurt to look at. The very air seemed thick and oily, like breathing through fabric. "Where are we?" I asked. "Somewhere else," Marcus replied. "Somewhere we shouldn't be." We followed the stream, hoping it would lead us back to familiar territory. But the landscape around us became increasingly alien. The trees grew in spirals, their branches reaching toward the ground instead of the sky. Flowers bloomed in colors that didn't exist, their petals moving without any wind. That's when we heard the crying. It came from ahead of us, the sound of a child sobbing, a lost little girl, maybe 4 or 5 years old, calling for her mother. "Help me," the voice pleaded. "I'm lost. I can't find my mommy." Marcus grabbed my arm. "Don't listen to it." But the crying was so heartbreaking, so genuinely distressed that every instinct screamed at me to help. Through the twisted trees, I could see a small figure in a white dress sitting on a fallen log with her face in her hands. "Please," she sobbed. "I'm scared." "It's a child," I said, starting toward her. Marcus yanked me back so hard I nearly fell. "Look at her shadow." I looked. The little girl cast no shadow on the moonlit ground. But something else did. Something with too many limbs and claws like broken glass. The sobbing stopped. The little girl looked up, and her face was Marcus's face, twisted into a parody of childish innocence. "Found you," she said in Marcus's voice. We ran deeper into the nightmare landscape, the fake child's laughter following us like poisoned wind. The stream curved and twisted, sometimes running uphill, sometimes flowing in impossible directions. Fish swam through the air above our heads, their scales glinting like wet metal. "This place isn't real," I gasped as we stumbled through the water. "It can't be real." "Real enough to kill us," Marcus replied. That's when I noticed his reflection in the water. It showed my face looking back at me. I stopped so suddenly that Marcus crashed into me. "Look at the water," I whispered. He looked down and saw his reflection wearing my features. For a moment, we stared at each other in horrible understanding. "How long?" I asked. "I don't know." His voice, my voice, was hollow with despair. "I don't remember when it happened." The thing wearing Marcus's body smiled my smile. "Does it matter? We're both lost now. Both changed. Both wrong." I wanted to scream, to deny it, but deep down I knew he was right. I could feel the wrongness spreading through my thoughts like ink through water. Memories that weren't mine flickered at the edges of my consciousness. I remembered a childhood I'd never lived, parents I'd never had, a first kiss with a girl whose name I couldn't pronounce. "Fight it," I said, though I wasn't sure if I was talking to Marcus or myself. But the memories kept coming. I remembered being stalked through these woods, remembered the moment when the skinwalkers caught me, remembered the feeling of my skin being peeled away and worn by something else. I remembered dying. And then I remembered being the one doing the stalking. The truth hit me like a physical blow. We weren't escaping the skinwalkers. We were the skinwalkers. Had been all along. The things that looked like Marcus weren't duplicates. They were the real Marcus, trying to escape what we'd become. "No," I whispered, but even my voice sounded wrong now, distorted and inhuman. Marcus, the thing wearing Marcus's face, laughed. "Do you understand now? We've been hunting ourselves. We've been the monsters all along." I looked at my hands and saw pale, translucent skin with black veins writhing underneath. When I touched my face, I felt features that shifted and changed beneath my fingers. In the dark water, my reflection showed a dozen different faces, all twisted into expressions of hunger and malice. "When did it happen?" I asked, though I was no longer sure who was asking the question. "Does it matter?" Marcus replied. "Time means nothing here. We've been dead for minutes or centuries. We've been hunting for food we can never digest, wearing skins that never quite fit." The memories came flooding back then. Not my memories, but the memories of the thing I'd become. I remembered the real Kenneth Young, terrified and alone in these woods. I remembered the moment we'd caught him, the exquisite taste of his fear, the way his skin had felt as we peeled it away in long, careful strips. And I remembered putting it on like a costume, like learning to walk upright, to speak with a human voice, to feel human emotions that meant nothing to my alien consciousness. "The camping trip," I said. "It never happened." "Oh, it happened," Marcus smiled. "Just not the way you remember. Kenneth Young and Marcus Thompson came to these woods 3 days ago. They made camp. They explored the old Cherokee trails. And then they met us." The false memories began to crumble, revealing the truth underneath. There had been no mysterious figures in the trees, no singing voices, no trail that changed direction. There had only been us, patient and hungry, watching the two friends set up their camp. We'd taken Marcus first, while Kenneth was gathering firewood. By the time he returned, we were already wearing Marcus's face, speaking with his voice, acting out a performance of friendship and concern. Kenneth never suspected. Even when we led him deeper into the woods, even when we began the hunt, he trusted us because we wore the face of his best friend. "Where are their bodies?" I asked. "There are no bodies," Marcus replied. "We are the bodies. We wear their meat, speak with their voices, carry their memories. In a way, they're more alive now than they ever were before." I tried to remember being human, but the memories felt thin and artificial, like props in a play. Had I ever really been Kenneth Young? Or was I just a collection of stolen thoughts and experiences, animated by something that had never been human at all? "What do we do now?" I asked. Marcus gestured toward the stream where I could see our reflections rippling in the dark water. But they weren't our reflections anymore. They showed two men in hiking gear, faces flushed with exertion and fear, stumbling through the wilderness in search of a trail that would lead them home. "We hunt," he said simply. The false landscape around us began to shift and change, reality reasserting itself in subtle ways. The twisted trees straightened, their branches reaching skyward once again. The impossible flowers faded like morning mist. The stream began flowing downhill, following the natural contours of the land. Soon, we were standing in a perfectly normal stretch of Cherokee wilderness, beside a perfectly normal stream. If not for the two figures I could see approaching through the trees, two hikers in their 30s, probably friends from the look of them, I might have believed the whole experience had been a dream. "My name is Kenneth Young," I practiced under my breath, testing the sound of the words. They felt strange in my mouth, like speaking a foreign language. "And I'm Marcus Thompson," my companion added. "We've been camping here for 2 days." The approaching hikers looked tired and lost. They'd probably been hiking for hours, following trails that led nowhere, checking GPS units that showed impossible readings. They'd be grateful to meet fellow campers, relieved to find friendly faces in the wilderness. They had no idea what we really were. "Hey there," one of them called out, raising his hand in greeting. "Boy, are we glad to see you guys. We've been hiking in circles for hours." I forced Kenneth Young's face into an expression of concern and sympathy. "You guys look beat. Our camp's not far from here. You're welcome to rest up, share a meal." "That would be amazing," the second hiker replied. "I'm David, and this is my buddy Paul. We were supposed to meet the Appalachian Trail about 2 miles back, but somehow we got turned around." "It happens," Marcus said with Marcus Thompson's easy smile. "These old Cherokee trails can be confusing. They don't always follow logical routes." As we led David and Paul toward our camp, the camp that existed only in stolen memories, I could feel the hunger growing in my chest, a gnawing emptiness that could only be filled with fresh terror and warm skin. Behind us, the two friends chatted about their hiking experience, their jobs back in Atlanta, their plans for the rest of the weekend. They had no idea they were already dead, that their lives had ended the moment they'd accepted our offer of help. But they would learn. Soon enough, they would understand what we were, what we needed, what we were going to do to them. And in their final moments, as we peeled away their identities like orange rinds, they would become part of us, adding their voices to the chorus of screams that echoed forever in the darkness behind our stolen eyes. The sun was setting behind Blood Mountain, painting the sky the color of fresh blood. In the distance, I could hear the first notes of our hunting song drifting through the trees, wordless and beautiful and terrible. It was going to be a lovely evening for a kill. My name is Kenneth Young, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Blood Mountain, deep in Georgia's Chattahoochee National Forest. And it's still happening. It will always be happening. We are patient, we are hungry, and we are very, very good at wearing human faces. The next time you're alone in the wilderness, the next time you meet friendly strangers on a remote trail, the next time someone offers to help when you're lost and afraid, remember Kenneth Young. Remember Marcus Thompson. Remember that some things that look human aren't human at all. And remember that in these ancient forests, time means nothing, death means nothing, and the only thing that matters is the endless eternal hunt. Welcome to our woods. We've been waiting for you. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the Cahutta wilderness of North Georgia, 3 miles past the Jacks River Falls trailhead, where the forest grows so thick that noon feels like twilight, and cell towers are nothing but a distant memory. I should have listened to the park ranger at the visitor center. His weathered face had gone pale when we told him our planned route through the most remote section of the wilderness. "Y'all sure about heading that deep?" he'd asked, his thick southern drawl carrying an edge I couldn't quite place. Been some unusual reports from that area lately. Folks going missing, or coming back different. But we'd laughed it off, 5 friends from our Atlanta marketing firm eager to disconnect from our digital lives for a long weekend of primitive camping. The group consisted of myself, my college roommate Sarah Davis, our coworkers Mark Clark and Daniel Lopez, and Daniel's girlfriend Amy Mitchell. We were all experienced hikers, or so we thought. We'd conquered sections of the Appalachian Trail, spent weekends in the Smokies, but the Cahutta wilderness was different. Older, wilder, more aware. The first day passed without incident. We hiked 8 miles along increasingly faint deer paths, our GPS units working sporadically under the dense canopy. Mark, our self-appointed leader with his military-style organization, had plotted our route to reach a remote clearing he'd found on satellite images. No other hikers for miles, he'd promised with a grin. Just us and nature. By late afternoon, we'd reached our destination, a circular meadow surrounded by towering hemlocks and ancient oaks draped in Spanish moss. The clearing felt wrong somehow. Too perfectly round, the grass too uniformly short, as if something had been grazing here regularly. But exhaustion overrode unease, and we made camp as the sun filtered through the canopy in sickly yellow shafts. Daniel, ever the outdoorsman, took charge of the fire while Sarah and Amy set up our tents in a defensive circle around the planned fire pit. I began organizing our food supplies, noting with growing concern that several cans in my pack had somehow developed dents and rust spots that hadn't been there that morning. The metal felt ice cold despite the warm afternoon air. "Jennifer, look at this," Mark called from the tree line where he'd been gathering firewood. I joined him at the base of a massive oak whose bark bore strange markings. They weren't natural scratches or disease patterns. Someone, or something, had carved symbols into the living wood. The cuts were fresh, weeping sap like golden blood, but the edges had already begun to heal in impossible spirals. "Probably just other campers marking their territory," I said, but my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. The symbols didn't look human. They curved and twisted in ways that hurt to follow with your eyes, creating an optical illusion that made my stomach lurch. That evening, as we sat around our crackling fire eating dehydrated camping meals, Daniel regaled us with local folklore he'd researched. The Cherokee called this area Anvia Asgaya, the place where spirits walk among men, he said, his face flickering orange and black in the firelight. They believed certain parts of the forest were thin places, where the boundary between worlds grew weak. "You're going to give Amy nightmares," Sarah laughed, but I noticed her voice carried a nervous edge. Amy just stared into the flames, unusually quiet for someone normally so animated. "The settlers who came later had their own stories," Daniel continued, seemingly oblivious to our discomfort. "They spoke of shapeshifters that could take human form, creatures that would lure people deep into the woods and change them, make them into something else." A branch snapped somewhere in the darkness beyond our fire's reach. We all froze, listening. The normal chorus of night insects had gone silent. "Probably just a deer," Mark said, but his hand moved instinctively to the hunting knife on his belt. Another snap, closer this time. Then another, circling our camp just outside the range of our flashlight beams. Whatever was out there moved with deliberate purpose, testing our perimeter. "Everyone stay calm," Mark whispered, standing slowly. "Jennifer, Sarah, get close to the fire. Daniel, Amy, grab the bear spray." But Amy didn't move. She continued staring into the flames with an intensity that made my skin crawl. In the dancing light, her face looked different somehow. The shadows fell wrong across her features, making her appear gaunt and hollow-eyed. "Amy?" Daniel touched her shoulder and she flinched violently as if waking from a trance. "What?" "Oh, sorry, I was just thinking." She smiled, but the expression didn't reach her eyes. Something fundamental had shifted in her mannerisms, a subtle wrongness that I couldn't quite identify. The circling sounds stopped as abruptly as they'd started. The insects resumed their chirping. We waited another hour before anyone felt comfortable enough to sleep, taking turns on watch duty. I drew the midnight shift, alone with the dying fire and my racing thoughts. The forest around our camp felt alive with malevolent attention. Every shadow seemed to shift and breathe. Every whisper of wind through the leaves sounded like voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize. At 2 a.m., I heard Amy's tent zipper opening. She emerged in her pajamas and bare feet, walking with measured steps toward the tree line. "Amy?" I called softly, not wanting to wake the others. She didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge my voice. She simply walked into the darkness between two massive pines and vanished. I grabbed my flashlight and followed, heart hammering against my ribs. The beam cut through the murky darkness, revealing Amy standing motionless about 30 yards from camp. She faced away from me, perfectly still, arms hanging at her sides. "Amy, what are you doing?" I whispered, approaching slowly. "You're going to freeze out here." She turned to face me, and I nearly dropped my flashlight. Her eyes reflected the beam like an animal's, glowing with an unnatural amber light. Her smile stretched too wide, revealing teeth that seemed sharper than they should be. "I'm listening," she said in a voice that didn't quite match her usual cadence. The words came out slightly off rhythm, as if she was remembering how to speak. "They have such interesting things to say." "Who has things to say?" "Amy. There's no one else out here." She tilted her head at an angle that made my neck ache just watching. "Of course there is. They've been talking about us since we arrived, about how long it's been since they had visitors, about how hungry they are." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Amy, you're scaring me. Let's go back to camp." She took a step closer, and I instinctively backed away. In the harsh LED light, I could see that her feet were covered in dirt and what looked like pine needles embedded in her skin, as if she'd been walking through the forest for hours. But I'd been watching. She'd only been gone for minutes. "You should be scared, Jennifer," she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "This place changes people. It makes them into what it needs them to be." I turned and ran back to camp, crashing through the underbrush with my flashlight beam dancing wildly ahead of me. Behind me, I heard Amy's laughter, but it sounded wrong. Too deep, too knowing, like several voices laughing in perfect unison. I burst into camp to find Daniel sitting up in his tent, rubbing his eyes. "Jennifer, what's wrong? Where's Amy?" I looked back toward the trees, but Amy was walking calmly back into the firelight, acting completely normal. "She was sleepwalking. I found her wandering around." Amy yawned and stretched, the picture of innocent confusion. "Sorry, did I wake everyone? I've been having weird dreams. Must be all that talk about shapeshifters." She laughed, and the sound was perfectly normal. No trace of the wrongness I'd heard moments before. Daniel wrapped her in a sleeping bag and led her back to their tent, murmuring reassurances. I spent the rest of my watch staring at their tent flap, wondering if I'd imagined the entire encounter. The next morning brought new horrors. Our food supplies had spoiled overnight, despite the cool mountain air. Meat had turned green and writhing with maggots. Canned goods had burst their seams, leaking foul-smelling contents that buzzed with flies. Even our sealed water bottles contained thick, murky liquid that smelled like stagnant pond water. "That's impossible," Mark said, poking at a package of dried fruit that now resembled decomposed flesh. "This stuff was fine yesterday." "Maybe animals got into it," Sarah suggested weakly, but we all knew no animal could have opened sealed containers and resealed them. Amy seemed unaffected by our predicament. If anything, she appeared more energetic than usual, her movements quick and precise. She volunteered to hike back to the main trail to signal for help with our emergency beacon. "I'll go with you," Daniel said, but Amy shook her head. "I'll move faster alone. Besides, someone needs to stay with the others." Her smile was warm and reassuring, but I noticed she avoided eye contact with me. We watched her disappear into the forest, and I felt a gnawing certainty that we'd made a terrible mistake. Hours passed. Our phones, which had been working intermittently the day before, now showed no signal despite indicating full battery. Our GPS units displayed impossible readings, showing our location as shifting constantly even though we remained stationary. "Something's very wrong here," Sarah said, voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Our equipment doesn't just fail like this." Mark had grown increasingly agitated, pacing the perimeter of our camp like a caged animal. "We need to get moving, following Amy's path back to the main trail." "What if she gets lost trying to find us again?" Daniel protested. "She could wander these woods for days." "She won't get lost," I said quietly. Everyone turned to look at me. "Because whatever came back with us last night isn't Amy." Daniel's face went white. "What are you talking about?" I told them about the previous night's encounter, about Amy's glowing eyes and strange behavior. As I spoke, I watched Daniel's expression transform from disbelief to dawning horror. "That's not possible," he whispered. I've known Amy for 3 years. We lived together. I would know if something was wrong." "When did you last hear her use your pet name for her?" I asked. "When did she last mention her sister's wedding next month? When did she last complain about her nut allergy?" Daniel opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. His face crumpled as realization hit. "She ate trail mix with peanuts this morning. She's deathly allergic to peanuts. She would never—" A scream echoed through the forest, high and terrified and unmistakably human. It came from the direction Amy had taken. "That's her!" Daniel jumped to his feet, grabbing his backpack. "She's in trouble." "No," I said firmly. "That's what it wants us to think. Whatever took Amy is trying to draw us deeper into the woods." But Daniel was already running toward the sound, crashing through the underbrush with Mark close behind. Sarah and I looked at each other, reading the same terrible knowledge in each other's eyes. "We can't just leave them," Sarah said. "We can't help them either," I replied. "Not if I'm right about what's happening here." Another scream, closer this time. Then silence. Sarah grabbed my arm. "We have to try. They're our friends." Against every instinct screaming in my head, we followed Daniel and Mark's trail. The forest seemed to close in around us as we moved deeper into its heart. The air grew thick and oppressive, carrying scents of decay and something else, something wild and predatory. We found Mark's backpack first, torn and scattered across a small clearing. His water bottles were shattered, contents mixing with dark stains in the pine needles. But there was no sign of Mark himself. Daniel's voice called from deeper in the woods. "Jennifer, Sarah, over here. I found her." We approached cautiously, flashlights raised despite the afternoon light. Daniel knelt beside a figure lying motionless in a bed of ferns. As we got closer, I could see it was Amy, or something wearing Amy's form. Her clothes were shredded, her skin pale and cold, but she was breathing, and when Daniel touched her face, her eyes fluttered open. "Daniel," she whispered, voice weak and perfectly, heartbreakingly normal. "What happened?" I remember walking, and then darkness. Daniel gathered her into his arms, tears streaming down his face. "It's okay, baby. You're safe now. We're going to get you out of here." But I noticed things that made my blood run cold. Amy's injuries were wrong. Too clean, too symmetrical. Her torn clothing showed no corresponding damage to the skin beneath. And, most telling of all, there were no footprints in the soft earth around where she lay, as if she'd simply materialized there. "Where's Mark?" I asked. Amy's eyes found mine, and for just a moment, I saw something alien looking back at me. "Who's Mark?" she asked innocently. Sarah gasped. Daniel's face went slack with shock. We'd known Mark for 2 years. He was Daniel's roommate, Amy's close friend. There was no way she could forget him. "We need to leave. Now," I said, backing away slowly. The thing wearing Amy's face smiled, and her teeth seemed sharper than before. "But, Jennifer, we're having so much fun, and the forest has such wonderful plans for all of you." She rose from Daniel's arms with fluid grace, moving in ways that human joints shouldn't allow. Her skin began to shift and ripple, revealing glimpses of something dark and angular beneath. Daniel stumbled backward, finally understanding. "Amy? Amy, what's happening to you?" "Amy's gone," the creature said, its voice layering with harmonics that made my inner ear ache. "She walked too far into the deep woods where the old hungers still remember how to feed. But don't worry, you'll see her soon. You'll all see each other very soon." It lunged at Daniel with inhuman speed. I grabbed Sarah's hand and ran, leaving Daniel's screams echoing behind us. We crashed through the forest in blind panic, branches tearing at our clothes and skin. Behind us, I could hear sounds of pursuit, but wrong sounds. Not footsteps, but a rhythmic scratching like claws on bark, coming from above us in the canopy. "The trees," Sarah gasped as we stumbled into another clearing. "It's moving through the trees." I looked up to see shapes flowing between the branches overhead, dark forms that moved too quickly for the eye to follow. But, occasionally, I caught glimpses of faces in the shifting mass. Amy's face, Mark's face, and others I didn't recognize. All of them twisted into expressions of hunger and malevolent joy. We reached our abandoned campsite as the sun began to set. Our tents had been shredded, gear scattered and broken. But more disturbing were the footprints surrounding our former camp. Dozens of them, all identical, as if the same person had walked in circles around our site for hours. "What do we do?" Sarah whispered. "Our GPS is useless, our food is gone, and those things are still out there." I was about to answer when Daniel emerged from the tree line. He looked normal, no injuries, his clothes intact, but something in his gait was off. Too measured, too careful, like someone concentrating on how to walk. "Thank God you're safe," he said, his voice carrying just the slightest hint of that same off-rhythm cadence I'd heard from Amy. "I got away, but I couldn't find Mark or Amy anywhere." Sarah started toward him, relief evident on her face, but I caught her arm. "Daniel," I called. "What was the name of that bar where we all met last year? The one with the terrible karaoke?" He smiled, but it was Amy's too wide smile on his face. "I don't remember, Jennifer. Does it matter right now?" The real Daniel would have immediately said Murphy's Pub and launched into his story about Mark's disastrous rendition of Sweet Caroline. This thing wearing his face had never been to that bar, had never lived those memories. "Run," I whispered to Sarah. The Daniel thing's head tilted at that impossible angle. "Now, Jennifer, there's no need for that. We just want to welcome you to the forest. We want to make you part of our family." More figures emerged from the trees around us. Mark's form, Amy's body, and others I didn't recognize. Hikers who had come to these woods before us and never left. All of them moved with that same careful, studied gait. All of them wore faces that smiled too wide and eyes that reflected light like mirrors. "You see," the Daniel thing continued, "this place is old. Older than the Cherokee, older than the trees themselves. It's hungry, and it's been hungry for so long. But it's learned to be patient. It knows how to make people comfortable, how to make them trust." The circle of false faces began to close in around us. I could smell decay on their breath, see the wrongness in how their joints bent. "The process is really quite painless," Mark's voice said from Mark's stolen face. "You just walk a little too far into the deep woods, and something else walks back out in your place. Your families never know the difference. Well, not at first." I thought about our families back in Atlanta, about the hugs and kisses these things would give them, about the slow realization that would eventually dawn as small details accumulated. How long would it take before people noticed? How many others had already been replaced? But survival instinct overrode existential horror. I grabbed a burning branch from our scattered fire and swept it in a wide arc. The creatures recoiled with hisses that sounded like steam escaping from broken pipes. "The fire!" I shouted to Sarah. "They don't like the fire!" We grabbed burning branches and began backing toward the tree line, using the flames to keep the false people at bay, their faces contorted with rage, revealing glimpses of the darkness beneath their stolen features. "You can't run forever," Amy's voice called after us. "This forest goes on for miles, and we know every path, every hiding place. Eventually, you'll have to sleep." But we didn't stop to listen. We plunged into the woods, following what I hoped was the path back toward civilization. Our makeshift torches wouldn't last long, and I could hear sounds of pursuit growing closer behind us. The next hours blurred together in a nightmare of running, stumbling, and hiding. Every shadow could conceal one of those things. Every sound might herald their approach. Our torches burned down to useless stubs, leaving us in darkness broken only by sporadic moonlight filtering through the canopy. Sarah collapsed around midnight, her ankle twisted from a fall over hidden roots. "I can't keep going," she gasped. "You have to leave me." "Not happening," I said, helping her to her feet. We stay together." But our pursuers were closing in. I could hear voices calling our names from multiple directions. Daniel's voice, Mark's voice, even Sarah's voice, though Sarah was right beside me. They were learning, adapting, trying to confuse and separate us. "Jennifer," Mark's voice called from ahead of us. "Over here, I found a ranger station." Through the trees, I could see electric lights, the first artificial illumination we'd seen since entering the deep woods. But something felt wrong about it. The lights were too bright, too perfect, like a movie set. "It's a trap," I whispered to Sarah. "Jennifer, Sarah." Amy's voice now coming from the direction of the lights. "We're safe. The rangers are here." Sarah struggled against my grip, desperation overriding caution. What if it's real? What if they actually made it out? But I'd noticed something that chilled me to the bone. The voices calling to us cast no echoes. In these dense woods, every sound should bounce and reverberate, but these calls fell flat and dead, as if the forest itself was swallowing them. We changed direction, moving parallel to the false lights. Almost immediately, the illumination began to shift, trying to follow our new path. Whatever was creating that glow was mobile, adaptive, and very much aware of our movements. "They're hurting us," I realized, "driving us towards something." And I was right. As we stumbled through a particularly dense thicket, we broke through into another clearing, but this one was different. The grass here was dead, bleached white in the moonlight. Bones littered the ground, some old and yellowed, others disturbingly fresh. This was a feeding ground, a place where the forest brought its prey to be consumed. At the center of the clearing stood a figure I initially took for another tree, until it moved. Tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that branched and subdivided like organic fractals. Its face was a shifting kaleidoscope of every person who had ever been taken by these woods. Amy's eyes, Mark's nose, Daniel's mouth, all flowing and changing in sickening patterns. "Welcome," it said in a voice like wind through dry leaves. "We've been waiting for you." This was the source, I realized, the original hunger that spawned all the false copies, and now it was done playing games. "You've been very resourceful," it continued, taking a step closer. "Most people succumb much more quickly, but resistance just makes the final surrender sweeter." Sarah whimpered beside me, but I felt a strange calm descending. I thought about the marking on the trees, the symbols we'd dismissed as human graffiti. But what if they weren't territorial markers? What if they were warnings? I pulled out my phone, knowing it wouldn't work but hoping its LED flash might serve as a weapon. As I activated the light, the creature recoiled with a shriek that shattered several dead branches overhead. "Iron," I whispered, understanding flooding through me. "The phone case has iron in it." I advanced on the creature, using the phone's light like a weapon. It writhed and twisted, trying to escape the beam, but I kept it focused on the shifting mass of stolen faces. "Sarah, your keys! Use your keys!" Sarah fumbled for her keychain, which included a heavy iron bottle opener her grandfather had given her. As she held it up, the creature's form began to destabilize, the borrowed faces melting away to reveal something ancient and terrible beneath. "This won't destroy us," it hissed. "Iron only weakens. We are eternal. We are hunger itself." But the creature was retreating now, melting back into the shadows at the edge of the clearing. As it withdrew, I heard other sounds, the false voices of our friends growing distant and distorted, like radio signals fading out of range. "The copies can't exist without the source nearby," I said. "We've broken its hold on this area." We ran then, following what we hoped was a path toward the main trail. Behind us, the forest erupted in sounds of rage and frustration, trees crashing, earth splitting, the death screams of something ancient being denied its prey. We reached the trailhead as the sun crested the mountain peaks, stumbling out of the wilderness and into the parking area where our car waited like salvation itself. I've never been so grateful to see asphalt and painted lines. The ranger station was just opening as we arrived, battered and exhausted. The same weathered ranger who had warned us looked unsurprised to see us emerge from the woods in such condition. "Lost some folks?" he asked quietly. I nodded, not trusting my voice. "Happens sometimes," he said. "Forest doesn't give everyone back. You two were lucky." "The police," Sarah began. "Won't find nothing," the ranger interrupted. "Never do. But I'll make the reports, start the searches. Got to go through the motions." As we drove away from the Cahutta wilderness, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see familiar faces chasing after us down the mountain road. But we were truly free. Sarah and I never spoke about what happened in detail. How could we? Who would believe us? Instead, we both quit our jobs, moved to different cities, started new lives as far from wilderness areas as possible. But sometimes, late at night, I get phone calls with no one on the other end. Sometimes I see faces in crowds that look like Daniel or Mark or Amy, always just turning away when I try to get a closer look. Sometimes I wonder how many people in the world are wearing borrowed faces, walking among us with hollow eyes and too wide smiles. The forest got its due from us in the end. Not our lives, but our peace of mind, our trust in the world around us. We survived the Cahutta wilderness, but we left something essential behind in those ancient woods. And late at night, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear Daniel's voice calling my name from somewhere far away, asking why we left him behind, asking when we're coming back to visit. I never answer. Some invitations are better left declined, but I keep my grandmother's iron cross on my nightstand now, and I never go camping anymore. Some hungers are older than civilization, and some appetites never truly fade. The forest is patient. The forest remembers. And the forest is always hungry for new faces to wear. My name is Kenneth Young, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the Cahutta wilderness, deep in the mountains of northern Georgia, 3 miles past the last ranger station where cell towers become meaningless and GPS signals die like whispered prayers in the wind. Brian Wright and I had been planning this trip for months. We'd met in college 15 years ago, bonded over late-night horror movies and cheap beer, and maintained our friendship through marriages, divorces, and the grinding mundanity of adult life. Brian worked as an accountant for a mid-sized firm in Atlanta, while I spent my days troubleshooting network issues for a tech company. We were both city boys who'd grown soft around the edges, but we still harbored romantic notions about conquering the wilderness. The plan was simple: a 5-day backpacking trip through the Cahutta, following the Jacks River Trail to the falls, then pushing deeper into the backcountry where few hikers ventured. Brian had been obsessing over topographical maps for weeks, plotting our route with the precision he usually reserved for tax returns. I'd handled the gear, 2-person tent, water filtration system, enough freeze-dried meals to sustain us, and a first aid kit that I hoped we'd never need. What I remember most about that first day was how wrong the silence felt. The Cahutta wilderness is supposed to be quiet. That's the point. But this wasn't the peaceful hush of nature settling into evening rhythms. This was the silence of held breath, of prey animals frozen in terror, of the forest itself waiting for something terrible to happen. The usual sounds: birdsong, rustling leaves, the distant chatter of squirrels, were absent. Even our footsteps seemed muffled, as if the trail were absorbing sound like a sponge soaking up blood. Brian noticed it too. I caught him stopping periodically, cocking his head to listen, his pale face creased with confusion. Brian had always been the nervous type, prone to anxiety attacks during college finals, but he'd insisted this trip would help him reconnect with his primal self. Looking at him now, sweating despite the October chill, I wondered if his primal self was better left undiscovered. "You hear that?" he asked around noon when we stopped for lunch beside Jack's River. I strained my ears, hearing only the gurgle of water over stones. "Hear what?" "Nothing," he said, and that's when I understood. The absence of sound was so complete it had become a presence unto itself. We'd been hiking for 6 hours, covering maybe 8 miles of increasingly treacherous terrain. The trail had degraded from well-maintained path to barely visible game track, forcing us to navigate by compass and instinct. Brian's meticulously planned route was proving optimistic at best. The topographical map showed clear landmarks, a creek crossing here, a ridgeline there, but the actual landscape seemed to shift when we weren't looking directly at it. "This doesn't match," Brian muttered, comparing his GPS unit to the paper map. The device showed our location as a blank space, no satellite signal, no breadcrumb trail marking our progress. According to this, we should be near Hemp Top, but I don't see any peak. I looked around at the dense canopy of oak and hickory, the steep ravines that seemed to fold in on themselves like origami made of stone and shadow. Nothing looked familiar, despite having studied the same maps for weeks. It was as if the wilderness had rearranged itself when our backs were turned, reshuffling valleys and ridges like cards in a cosmic deck. "Maybe we took a wrong turn," I suggested, though I couldn't remember any turns. The trail had been straightforward, almost hypnotically so, drawing us deeper with each step. Brian's laugh had an edge of hysteria. "Wrong turn where? We've been following the same path all day." That's when I noticed our shadows. Despite the overcast sky, they were sharp and dark against the rocky ground, but they seemed too long for the time of day. My shadows stretched behind me at an impossible angle, while Brian's fell across the path ahead, as if the sun were shining from multiple directions at once. I decided not to mention it, too. We pressed on, climbing steadily through increasingly dense forest. The trees grew taller and closer together, their branches interweaving overhead until only scattered fragments of gray light filtered through. The temperature dropped noticeably, our breath beginning to mist despite the afternoon hour. Brian was setting a punishing pace, driven by some internal urgency I didn't understand. "Slow down," I called, but he was already 20 yards ahead, moving with jerky mechanical steps like a marionette guided by an amateur puppeteer. That's when the smell hit me. It started as a faint sweetness, like overripe fruit, but quickly intensified into something far more disturbing. Decay, but not the honest rot of fallen leaves or dead animals. This was the smell of meat left too long in warm places, of things that had once been human but were no longer recognizable as such. It rolled through the forest in waves, making my eyes water and my stomach clench. Brian had stopped moving. He stood motionless on the trail ahead, his backpack rising and falling with rapid breaths, but he didn't turn around when I called his name. "Brian." Slowly, very slowly, he rotated to face me. His expression was blank, peaceful even, but his eyes were wrong. They reflected the dim light like an animal's, and when he smiled, I could see that his teeth were stained dark with something I didn't want to identify. "We're almost there," he said, his voice perfectly normal except for the way it seemed to echo from multiple directions. "Almost where?" "Home," he replied and turned away before I could ask what he meant. The next 2 hours blurred together in a haze of mounting dread. We climbed higher into terrain that shouldn't have existed according to our maps, following a path that appeared and disappeared based on some logic I couldn't grasp. The smell of decay grew stronger, occasionally shifting to other odors equally disturbing. Wet fur, burnt hair, the metallic tang of fresh blood. Brian maintained his mechanical pace, never looking back, never speaking unless I called to him. When he did respond, his answers made less and less sense. Yes, he was fine. No, he didn't smell anything unusual. We were exactly where we were supposed to be, following the path that had always been there, heading toward the place we'd always been meant to find. By late afternoon, my nerves were frayed to breaking. Every shadow seemed to move independently of its source. Every tree looked identical to the last. creating a sensation of walking in circles despite the steady climb. My compass spun wildly, pointing in different directions each time I checked it, as if magnetic north had become a matter of opinion rather than fact. The breaking point came when we reached what Brian insisted was our planned campsite. It was a clearing roughly 50 feet across, surrounded by ancient oaks whose trunks were easily 6 feet in diameter. The ground was carpeted with leaves that had turned black with age, creating a surface that felt spongy and unstable underfoot. At the center of the clearing sat a fire pit made of stones arranged in a perfect circle, with charred logs still smoldering despite no evidence of recent human activity. "Perfect," Brian said, dropping his pack with satisfaction. "Just like I remembered it." "Remembered?" I stared at him. "We've never been here before." He began setting up his tent with practiced efficiency, as if he'd performed this exact routine in this exact spot countless times before. "Of course we have. This is where we always camp." A chill that had nothing to do with temperature raced down my spine. Brian was talking like we'd been coming to this place for years, but I'd never seen it before in my life. The clearing wasn't on any of our maps, and the fire pit looked far older than any recent camping trip could account for. The stones were worn smooth by centuries of weather, their surfaces stained with substances I didn't want to examine too closely. I pitched my own tent on the opposite side of the clearing, as far from Brian as possible without seeming obvious about it. Something was very wrong with my oldest friend. Had been wrong since we'd entered this place, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly what had changed. His mannerisms were familiar, his voice unchanged, his physical appearance identical. Yet some fundamental aspect of Brianness had been subtly altered, like a photograph where someone had moved a piece of furniture just an inch to the left. Night fell with unnatural swiftness, the gray twilight dissolving into absolute darkness in a matter of minutes. I'd brought a headlamp and several backup flashlights, but their beams seemed pathetically weak against the pressing black. The darkness here wasn't merely the absence of light, it was a living thing, thick and suffocating, that pushed against our small circle of illumination like oil trying to seep through a cracked seal. Brian had built up the fire, adding logs that burned with colors I'd never seen before. Blue flames danced alongside traditional orange ones, occasionally flickering green or purple, casting our shadows in directions that defied the laws of physics. He sat cross-legged beside the pit, staring into the flames with an expression of deep contentment. "Beautiful night," he said without looking up. I glanced at the impenetrable darkness surrounding us. "Can't see much of it." "You're not looking in the right place." When I asked what he meant, he didn't answer. He'd begun humming under his breath, a melody I didn't recognize but that seemed somehow familiar, like a half-remembered lullaby from childhood. The tune was simple, almost childlike, but there was something deeply unsettling about hearing it in this context. It reminded me of music boxes winding down, of songs that play in empty houses. Dinner was a surreal affair. Brian ate his freeze-dried beef stroganoff with mechanical precision, chewing each bite exactly 20 times before swallowing, while maintaining constant eye contact with me across the fire. When he smiled, which he did frequently, his teeth caught the multicolored flames in ways that made them look sharp and predatory. "Tell me about your childhood," he said suddenly. "You know about my childhood. We've been friends for 15 years. Humor me." So I told him stories he'd heard dozens of times before, growing up in suburban Columbus. My parents' messy divorce when I was 12, the summer I'd broken my arm falling from our neighbor's apple tree. But as I spoke, I realized Brian was taking notes, actual notes, in a small leather journal I'd never seen before, writing down details with the focus of someone conducting an interview. "What are you doing?" "Just trying to understand," he said, not looking up from his writing. "Understand what?" "What it's like to be you." The fire popped loudly, sending a shower of sparks into the darkness. For just a moment, in the brief flare of light, I could have sworn I saw shapes moving between the trees. tall, thin figures that seemed to be watching us from the edge of the clearing. But when I turned my headlamp toward them, there was nothing there except the impenetrable wall of night. Brian hadn't noticed. He was still writing in his journal, occasionally pausing to study my face with scientific detachment. "I think I'll turn in," I announced, unable to bear his scrutiny any longer. "Good idea. Tomorrow will be a big day." "Big how?" But he'd already returned to his writing, humming that disturbing melody under his breath. I retreated to my tent, zipping the rainfly completely closed despite the mild weather. The nylon walls felt impossibly thin against the darkness outside, offering only the illusion of protection. I lay in my sleeping bag fully clothed, listening to Brian moving around the campfire. His footsteps followed a strange pattern. 3 steps left, pause, 3 steps right, pause, repeat, like a sentry walking a predetermined route or an animal pacing in its cage. Sleep came in fragments, punctuated by dreams that felt more like memories of events that hadn't happened yet. I dreamed of walking through endless forests where every tree was identical, of finding clearings filled with fire pits that burned without fuel, of meeting other versions of myself who all claimed to be the real Kenneth Young. In one particularly vivid dream, I was sitting around a campfire with a dozen different Brians, all of them humming that same melody while taking notes about my childhood. I woke sometime before dawn to the sound of Brian's tent zipper opening. Through the thin walls of my own shelter, I could see his silhouette moving around the clearing. But his movements were wrong again. Too fluid, too graceful, like someone who had never quite learned how human locomotion was supposed to work. He walked to the fire pit and began adding more logs, though I couldn't remember seeing him collect firewood the night before. The flames leaped higher, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. And in that fitful light, I finally saw what had been bothering me about Brian since we'd arrived at this place. He wasn't breathing. His chest never rose or fell. His mouth never opened to take in air. He moved and spoke and performed all the functions of a living person, but the fundamental rhythm of respiration was absent. I watched for 10 minutes, convinced I must be mistaken, but there was no doubt. Whatever was wearing my friend's body no longer had need for oxygen. When the sun finally rose, though its light seemed wan and gray compared to the supernatural fire, I emerged from my tent to find Brian sitting exactly where I'd left him the night before. He looked up at my approach with that same peaceful smile. "Sleep well." "Fine," I lied. "You?" "I don't sleep much anymore." He said this casually, as if it were a minor habit he'd recently picked up. "Too much to think about." "Like what?" "Like how much farther we have to go." I stared at him. "Go where? We're supposed to head back today, and this was the turnaround point." Brian's smile widened, showing too many teeth. "We can't go back. Kenneth, we haven't finished what we came here to do." "And what's that?" "You'll understand soon enough." He stood and began breaking camp with the same mechanical efficiency he'd shown the night before. When I asked where we were going, he pointed deeper into the forest, toward a section of wilderness that our maps showed as a blank space marked only with warnings about dangerous terrain. "There's nothing out there," I protested. "There's everything out there." I wanted to refuse, to insist we stick to our original plan, but something in Brian's expression stopped me. Not threat, exactly, but a kind of patient certainty that suggested argument would be futile. He would continue with or without me, and the thought of being left alone in this place was more terrifying than following him deeper into the unknown. We broke camp in silence, Brian leading the way along a trail that appeared beneath his feet like magic. I tried to memorize landmarks. A distinctive boulder here, a lightning-struck tree there, but they all seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The forest was rewriting itself around us, erasing our path back to civilization with each step forward. The second day was worse than the first. The absence of wildlife became absolute. No birds, no insects, no small mammals rustling through underbrush that had grown thick and twisted, as if the plants themselves were trying to block our passage. The trees took on grotesque shapes, trunks that spiraled like corkscrews, branches that formed perfect geometric patterns, leaves that grew in impossible colors ranging from deep purple to metallic silver. Brian maintained his inhuman pace, never tiring, never needing rest or water. When I called for breaks, he would stop and wait with infinite patience, but I could feel his impatience radiating from him like heat from a furnace. He wanted to reach our destination, wherever that might be, and my human limitations were merely obstacles to be endured. "Where are we going?" I asked during one of these reluctant stops. "To meet the others." "What others?" "The ones who've been waiting." I tried a different approach. "Brian, what happened to you yesterday? You've been acting strange since we reached that clearing." He considered this with the same scientific detachment he'd shown while taking notes about my childhood. "Nothing happened to me. I simply remembered who I really am." "And who's that?" "Someone who's been wearing this shape for far too long." He gestured at his body with distaste. "But that will change soon. We'll all remember who we really are." The implication hit me like a physical blow. Brian wasn't acting strange because something had happened to him. He was acting strange because he was no longer Brian. Something else was wearing my friend's skin, speaking with his voice, accessing his memories to maintain the charade. And whatever it was, it had plans for me. I should have run then. Should have waited until nightfall and slipped away while the thing that looked like Brian was distracted. But where would I go? My compass was useless, my GPS dead, and the trail behind us had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. The forest had become a maze with no exit, designed to funnel us toward whatever waited at its heart. So I followed the Brian thing deeper into the wilderness, because the alternative was to face the darkness alone. By evening, we'd reached terrain that defied every principle of geography I understood. We were climbing steadily upward, but the air grew thicker instead of thinner, humid and oppressive like the atmosphere before a violent storm. The trees grew larger and more distorted, their trunks twisting together in impossible helixes, their branches forming cathedral arches overhead. And then, just as full darkness fell, we emerged into a clearing that made our previous campsite look mundane by comparison. This space was enormous, easily 200 yards across, perfectly circular and completely devoid of vegetation. The ground was smooth black stone, polished to mirror brightness, that reflected the stars in patterns that didn't match the actual sky. At the center rose a structure that my mind initially refused to process. Part ancient temple, part modern architecture, part organic growth. Pillars of what might have been bone or marble supported a roof that seemed to be made of crystallized darkness, and surrounding the entire structure were dozens of fire pits, each burning with those same multicolored flames we'd seen the night before. But it wasn't the architecture that made my blood freeze. It was the people. Dozens of them stood around the fires, all perfectly still, all staring in our direction with expressions of terrible anticipation. Men and women in hiking gear, their faces pale and waxy in the supernatural light. As we approached, I began to recognize some of them from missing person reports I'd seen on the news over the years. Hikers who'd vanished in various wilderness areas throughout the southeast, their disappearances attributed to exposure, animal attacks, or simple bad luck. They were all here, all waiting, all wearing the same peaceful smile that had transformed Brian's face. "Welcome home," said a woman standing near the closest fire pit. I recognized her from a news story 3 years ago. Sarah Martinez, a nurse from Augusta who'd disappeared while hiking the Appalachian Trail. But her voice was wrong, carrying harmonics that suggested multiple speakers speaking in perfect unison. The crowd began to move toward us with synchronized steps, their movements flowing like a coordinated dance. As they drew closer, I could see that their eyes reflected the firelight with the same animal gleam I'd noticed in Brian's gaze. "Don't be afraid," Brian said softly. "It doesn't hurt." "What doesn't hurt?" remembering who you really are. The circle of false people tightened around us. I caught glimpses of their hands as they moved, fingers that were too long and jointed in too many places, nails that curved like talons. Whatever was wearing these human shapes wasn't particularly good at maintaining the disguise up close. I bolted. The rational part of my mind knew it was hopeless. Where could I run in this transformed landscape? But pure animal panic drove me toward the tree line, sprinting across the polished stone surface while inhuman voices called my name behind me. They weren't shouting or angry. They sounded patient, almost amused, like adults playing hide-and-seek with a child. I crashed into the forest at full speed, branches whipping at my face, roots catching my feet, the beam of my headlamp dancing wildly through twisted trees. Behind me, I could hear them following, but not running. They maintained that same synchronized walking pace, confident in their ability to find me. The chase lasted hours, or maybe minutes. Time had become as meaningless as direction in this place. I ran through groves where every tree grew upside down, their roots reaching toward a star-filled sky. I stumbled across streams that flowed uphill, their water reflecting scenes from my childhood with perfect clarity. I passed through clearings filled with structures that hurt to look at directly, their geometries violating several fundamental laws of physics. And always, just at the edge of perception, I could hear them following. Not just the creatures from the central clearing, but others. Things that had never worn human shapes, entities that moved through the darkness with sounds like breaking bones and tearing flesh. This forest was their domain, had always been their domain, and I was an intruder who'd finally wandered too far from the safety of civilization. I finally collapsed against the base of an enormous oak, my lungs burning, my legs no longer able to support my weight. The sounds of pursuit had faded, leaving me alone in a silence so complete it pressed against my eardrums like physical weight. My headlamp was dying, its beam reduced to a feeble yellow glow that barely penetrated the surrounding darkness. That's when I heard Brian calling my name. Not the inhuman chorus from the clearing, but Brian's actual voice. Scared, confused, human. It came from somewhere ahead, barely audible through the trees. "Kenneth! Kenneth, where are you?" I almost didn't answer. How could I know this was really my friend and not another trick? But something in his tone, the raw terror that no supernatural entity could perfectly mimic, convinced me to respond. "Here, I'm here." Crashing sounds in the underbrush getting closer. Then Brian burst through a screen of hanging moss, his face streaked with dirt and tears, his eyes bright with genuine human fear. "Thank God," he gasped, falling to his knees beside me. "I thought I'd lost you forever." "Brian, is it really you?" "Of course it's me." He grabbed my shoulders, his hands warm and solid and entirely human. What happened to us? One minute we were setting up camp, the next thing I knew I was standing in some kind of temple surrounded by things wearing people's faces. His story poured out in fragments. He remembered arriving at the clearing, remembered setting up his tent. But everything after that was a blur of half-formed images and sensations. Walking through endless darkness, seeing himself from outside his own body, feeling something else directing his movements while his consciousness watched helplessly from within. It was like being trapped in a nightmare, he said. I could see you, could hear myself talking to you, but I couldn't control what I was saying or doing. And the whole time, there was something else in my head, learning everything about me, copying my memories. I told him about the clearing, about the things wearing human faces, about the chase through the transformed forest. As I spoke, his expression grew increasingly grim. "They're still out there," he said. "I can feel them searching. Whatever those things are, they won't give up easily. Then we need to get out of here." "But how? My compass is spinning like a top, and I don't recognize any of this terrain. It's like the whole forest has been rearranged." I was about to answer when we heard it, that synchronized footstep pattern from the clearing, coming through the trees toward us. Multiple sets of feet moving in perfect rhythm, getting closer. "Run!" Brian whispered. We fled deeper into the twisted landscape, my friend proving himself fully human again by stumbling over roots and gasping for breath just as badly as I was. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, joined by other noises that belonged to nothing I could identify. Clicking, chittering, scraping sounds that suggested anatomy far removed from anything mammalian. We ran until we reached the edge of a cliff that shouldn't have existed, looking down into a chasm so deep our headlamp beams couldn't find the bottom. The sounds of pursuit were getting closer, and I could see lights moving through the trees behind us. Not electric lights, but the same multicolored flames we'd seen in the fire pits. We're trapped, Brian said. That's when I noticed the rope. It was anchored to a boulder near the cliff's edge, disappearing over the side into darkness. Not modern climbing rope, but something that looked hand-woven from organic fibers, yet strong enough to support our weight. Someone, or something, had left it there deliberately. It could be a trap, Brian warned. Everything here is a trap. The lights were getting closer, accompanied by voices calling our names in perfect harmony. I grabbed the rope and started rappelling down the cliff face, Brian following immediately behind. The rock was solid beneath our feet, offering good purchase, but the darkness below remained absolute. We descended for what felt like hours, the sounds of pursuit fading above us. When we finally reached the bottom, we found ourselves in a narrow canyon with walls that rose beyond the reach of our lights. A path led away from the cliff face, marked by small cairns of stacked stones. Someone's been here before, Brian observed. The question is whether they made it out. We followed the trail through the canyon, our headlamps creating a small bubble of visibility in the pressing darkness. The walls gradually widened, and we began to hear water running somewhere ahead. After another mile, we emerged onto the bank of a river that seemed to glow with its own phosphorescent light. And there, drawn up on the muddy shore, was a canoe. It was old, centuries old by the look of it, carved from a single massive log and decorated with symbols that seemed to shift in the unstable light. But it was watertight and equipped with paddles, and the river flowed away from the nightmare forest behind us. "Gift horse," I said, mouth-looking. Brian nodded grimly. "At this point, I'll take supernatural assistance over staying here." We pushed the canoe into the phosphorescent water and began paddling downstream. The current was swift, carrying us away from the canyon and the horrors above. For the first time in 2 days, I began to hope we might actually escape this place. The river wound through landscapes that gradually became more normal. Ordinary trees, natural rock formations, familiar constellations overhead. By dawn, we were floating through terrain I recognized from our original topographical maps, still several miles from civilization but clearly back in the real world. We beached the canoe near a Forest Service access road and hiked out to find my truck exactly where we'd left it, covered with 3 days' worth of dust and autumn leaves. Our camping gear was still in the clearing where we'd abandoned it, though neither of us suggested going back to retrieve it. The drive back to Atlanta passed in relative silence. What could we say? That we'd stumbled into some pocket dimension where malevolent entities wore human faces like Halloween masks? That my best friend had been possessed by something that wanted to harvest our identities? That we'd escaped only through the inexplicable assistance of whatever force had left that rope and canoe? Brian returned to his job, his apartment, his normal life. We tried to maintain our friendship, but something had changed between us. Not because I doubted his humanity. The entity that had worn his shape for those terrible hours was clearly gone, but because we'd both seen how easily the boundaries between self and other could be violated, how thin the membrane was between civilization and the hungry darkness that waited just beyond its borders. I researched the area obsessively in the weeks that followed, looking for some rational explanation for what we'd experienced. The Cahutta wilderness has a long history of strange disappearances, dating back to Cherokee legends about the region being a thin place where the spirit world bleeds through. Early European settlers reported entire families vanishing without trace, their cabins found empty but undisturbed, as if the occupants had simply walked away from their lives. Modern disappearances follow similar patterns. Experienced hikers who know the terrain, equipped with GPS and emergency beacons, who simply vanish. Search and rescue teams find no trace, no clues, no evidence of where they might have gone. The official reports cite exposure, animal attacks, or simple misadventure. But I know better now. Some of them found that clearing with its impossible architecture and synchronized inhabitants. Some of them were consumed by entities that learned to wear their faces, to speak with their voices, to access their memories. And some of them, the lucky ones, might have escaped to tell stories that no one would believe. I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, convinced I can hear that synchronized footstep pattern outside my apartment window. When I check, there's never anyone there, just the normal sounds of urban nightlife. But I've started keeping my hiking boots by the front door, along with a small backpack containing emergency supplies, because I know that someday something wearing a familiar face will come knocking, and when it does, I want to be ready to run. The Cahutta Wilderness remains open to hikers and campers, its dangers officially limited to bears, venomous snakes, and the usual hazards of backcountry travel. The Forest Service has no record of the clearing we found, the temple that defied architectural logic, or the river that glowed with its own light. According to their maps, none of those places exist. And maybe they don't, most of the time. Maybe that pocket of wrongness only manifests when conditions are right, when the barriers between worlds grow thin enough for something ancient and hungry to push through. Maybe we were just unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or maybe we were exactly where we were meant to be, called by forces beyond our understanding to serve a purpose we never fully grasped. Maybe our escape was part of some larger design, and the real horror isn't what we experienced in those woods, but what we carried back with us into the world of electric lights and cell phone towers. I try not to think about that possibility, but sometimes when I catch my reflection in unexpected places, store windows, the black screen of my computer, the surface of my morning coffee, I study my features carefully, looking for any sign that the thing staring back might not be entirely me. The eyes are the hardest to trust. They reflect light just slightly wrong, as if the person behind them has learned human expressions from observation rather than experience. And sometimes, very late at night, I catch myself humming a simple, childlike melody that I don't remember learning. When I realize what I'm doing, I stop immediately, but I can never quite forget how the tune continues, or how peaceful it makes me feel to let it play out to its inevitable conclusion. Brian doesn't call anymore. The last time we spoke, 6 months after our trip, he sounded exactly like himself. Same voice, same mannerisms, same memories of our shared past. But when I mentioned the Cahutta, asked if he ever thought about what happened to us there, he claimed not to know what I was talking about. "Camping trip," he said, sounding genuinely confused. "Kenneth, we haven't been camping together since college." Maybe the trauma was too much for him to process, forcing his mind to reject the memories entirely. Maybe whatever had worn his shape for those hours left behind psychological scars that only healing through forgetting could address. Or maybe the thing that came back from the forest wasn't quite as human as I'd believed. I prefer not to examine that possibility too closely. The Cahutta Wilderness remains open, its trails marked and maintained, its dangers cataloged in official reports that mention nothing about clearings that exist outside normal geography or entities that collect human identities like trophies. Every year, new hikers venture into its depths, drawn by the promise of solitude and natural beauty. Most of them return with nothing more than photos and memories of a successful backcountry adventure. But not all of them. And sometimes, in the missing person reports that appear with disturbing regularity in local newspapers, I recognize something in the descriptions that makes my blood run cold. Experienced hikers who knew the terrain. Well-equipped expeditions that should have been routine. people who simply walked away from their lives and never came back. I keep a folder of these articles, though I'm not sure why. Perhaps as evidence that I'm not losing my mind, that what Brian and I experienced was real. Perhaps as warning signs to watch for, indicators that the hungry darkness is stirring again. Or perhaps because some part of me, some small voice that whispers late at night when sleep won't come, wonders if I should go back. The forest is waiting, patient as stone, old as the mountains themselves. It has all the time in the world to reclaim what it considers its own. And deep in my heart, in places I don't like to examine too closely, I know that what happened to us in those woods isn't over. It's just beginning. The canoe that carried us to safety sites somewhere downstream, waiting for the next desperate souls who need passage between worlds. The rope hangs ready at the cliff's edge, anchored by forces that have nothing to do with human engineering. And in the clearing at the heart of the forest, where firelight dances in colors that shouldn't exist, patient figures continue their eternal vigil. They're waiting for us to come home, and someday, when the walls between worlds grow thin enough, we will. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the Cahutta wilderness of North Georgia, 3 miles southeast of Fort Mountain State Park, in October of last year. The idea for the camping trip came from Rebecca Hill, our marketing coordinator at the insurance firm where we all worked. She'd been pushing the team-building angle hard ever since our quarterly reviews came back showing communication issues between departments. I should have known better than to agree, but after 12 years of cubicle life, the promise of crisp mountain air and a weekend away from spreadsheets sounded like salvation. Our group consisted of 5 people. Myself, Rebecca, Thomas Davis from accounting, Jennifer Williams from claims processing, no relation despite the shared surname, and Scott Evans from customer service. Scott had been with the company the longest, 15 years of slowly watching his hairline recede and his optimism fade. Jennifer was the newest hire, barely 6 months in, still eager to please and make connections. Thomas was somewhere in between, competent but unremarkable, the kind of person you forget was in meetings until he spoke up about budget discrepancies. Rebecca had chosen the location after researching authentic wilderness experiences online. The Cahutta Wilderness, she explained enthusiastically, was Georgia's largest wilderness area, stretching across 37,000 acres of pristine forest with minimal human interference. No cell towers, no civilization for miles, she'd said, as if this was a selling point rather than a warning. We met at the Conestoga River Trail parking area on Friday afternoon, October 13th. I remember the date because Jennifer had joked about it being unlucky, and Thomas had rolled his eyes and muttered something about superstitions being for children. The parking area was nothing more than a gravel lot surrounded by towering pines and maples just beginning their autumn transformation. A weathered wooden sign marked the trailhead, its paint peeling and some letters barely visible. Conestoga River Trail, 5.2 miles to Tear Britches Creek. The air carried that crisp bite that October brings to the mountains, sharp and clean, cutting through your lungs with each breath. Mixed with it was the earthy smell of decomposing leaves and the distant sound of water moving over rocks. It should have been peaceful. It should have been exactly what we needed. Scott was already there when I arrived, methodically checking his gear with the precision of someone who'd done this before. His backpack was military surplus, olive drab and functional, strapped tight with sleeping bag and tent attached with practiced efficiency. He nodded when he saw me but didn't smile. Scott never smiled much anymore, not since his divorce the previous year. "You bring everything on the list?" he asked, gesturing toward my new REI backpack that still had tags attached to some of the straps. "Think so," I said, though I was suddenly uncertain. Rebecca had sent a detailed packing list, but camping gear was foreign territory for me. The closest I'd come to wilderness survival was watching Bear Grylls on TV. Jennifer arrived next, struggling with an oversized pink backpack that looked like it belonged in a sorority house rather than the wilderness. She was wearing brand new hiking boots that squeaked with each step, and her blonde hair was pulled back in a ponytail that somehow still looked professionally styled despite being outdoors. "This is so exciting," she said, bouncing slightly on her squeaky boots. "I've never been camping before. Well, not real camping. My family used to rent an RV when I was little, but that doesn't count, right?" Thomas pulled up in his sedan just as Rebecca arrived in her Subaru. They approached our gathering group with the kind of forced enthusiasm people reserve for company picnics and mandatory training seminars. "All right, team," Rebecca announced, consulting a laminated checklist. "Let's do a final gear check before we hit the trail. We want to reach the campsite before dark." The campsite Rebecca had selected was an unmarked clearing roughly 3 miles in, near a tributary of Tearbridge's Creek. She'd found it marked on some online forum for serious backpackers, described as primitive and secluded, perfect for those seeking genuine wilderness solitude. The forum post had included GPS coordinates and a warning about the area being off the beaten path, with no cell service and limited ranger patrols. We started hiking at 3:47 p.m. I remember checking my watch because Scott had insisted we needed to maintain a specific pace to reach the site with adequate daylight for setup. The trail began wide and well-maintained, clearly marked with white blazes on the trees. The sound of our footsteps on packed earth was rhythmic, almost meditative, accompanied by the occasional snap of a twig or rustle of leaves. For the first hour, conversation flowed easily. Jennifer chattered about her weekend plans before remembering she was currently living them. Thomas discussed interest rates and their impact on home insurance claims. Rebecca pointed out various plant species she'd researched beforehand, though I suspected she was making half of it up. The trail began to narrow after the first mile, and the blazes became less frequent. The canopy thickened overhead, filtering the afternoon sunlight into strange, shifting patterns on the forest floor. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the sounds of civilization, distant car engines, aircraft, faded completely. It was around the 2-mile mark when things started feeling wrong, though I couldn't articulate why at the time. The forest had grown unnaturally quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of nature, but the oppressive silence that comes when everything with sense enough to flee has already done so. Our footsteps seemed too loud, our voices too sharp against the stillness. Scott noticed it first. He stopped abruptly, holding up his hand for silence. We stood frozen on the trail, listening to nothing. "What is it?" Rebecca whispered, though there was no reason to whisper. "Birds," Scott said quietly. "There are no birds." He was right. For the past 20 minutes I hadn't heard a single bird call. No rustle of squirrels in the trees, no buzz of insects. The forest around us was as silent as a tomb. "Maybe they migrate or something," Jennifer suggested, but her voice carried uncertainty. Thomas checked his phone. "No signal," he announced, though we'd expected that. "GPS is acting weird, too. Shows us about a half-mile off the trail." "Phones get confused in heavy forest," Rebecca said quickly, but I caught the slight tremor in her voice. "The GPS coordinates from the forum are accurate. We just need to trust the directions." We continued hiking, but the easy camaraderie of the first hour was gone. Our group stretched out along the trail, with Scott leading and Jennifer bringing up the rear, struggling with her oversized pack. The silence pressed in around us like a physical weight. The trail became increasingly difficult to follow. What had started as a clear path began to fragment into deer tracks and false trails that led nowhere. The white blazes disappeared entirely. Rebecca insisted we were still on the right route, consulting her printed directions and the GPS coordinates she'd saved on her phone, but doubt was creeping into all our minds. It was Thomas who first spotted the tree. "What the hell is that?" he said, pointing to a massive oak about 50 yards off what remained of the trail. The tree was enormous, easily 6 feet in diameter. its trunk scarred with deep gouges that looked deliberately carved rather than naturally occurring. The marks formed a pattern, not random scratches from animal claws, but something that suggested intelligence, purpose. The gouges were too deep, too uniform, and they spiraled around the trunk in a way that made my eyes water when I tried to follow the pattern. "Probably just bear markings," Scott said, but he was backing away from the tree as he spoke. "Black bears mark territory sometimes." "Bears don't carve spirals," Thomas pointed out. His accounting mind naturally sought logical explanations, but the logic was failing him here. Jennifer had gone very pale. "Can we please just find the campsite? I'm getting really tired." Rebecca consulted her directions again, frowning at the paper as if the words might rearrange themselves into something more helpful. "According to this, we should be very close. The clearing should be just ahead, near the creek." We found the creek 15 minutes later, but it was wrong. Instead of the clear mountain stream described in the forum post, we discovered a sluggish, dark channel barely 3 feet wide. The water moved with an oily consistency, and it smelled wrong. Not the clean scent of mountain water, but something organic and decay-tinged that made my stomach clench. "This can't be right," Rebecca said, but she was already unpacking her gear. "Maybe it's just seasonal. Mountain streams change." The clearing was there, exactly where the coordinates indicated it should be. It was a rough circle of open ground, perhaps 30 feet across, surrounded by trees that seemed to lean inward as if trying to block out the sky. The grass was sparse and yellowed, and the ground had a spongy quality that suggested poor drainage. "Well," Scott said, surveying the site with obvious displeasure, "it's secluded." We set up camp with mechanical efficiency, trying to ignore the growing unease that seemed to emanate from the forest around us. My tent, a 2-person dome that had seemed perfectly adequate at the sporting goods store, looked pitifully small against the oppressive darkness of the surrounding trees. The sun was setting by the time we finished, though it was impossible to tell where exactly it was in the sky. The canopy was so thick that twilight seemed to seep up from the ground rather than descend from above. Temperature was dropping rapidly, and our breath began to mist when we spoke. Rebecca had brought a camp stove, but Scott insisted on building a fire. "Part of the authentic experience," he said, though I suspected he was more interested in having light and warmth than authenticity. The wood we gathered was damp and reluctant to burn. When the fire finally caught, the flames flickered strangely, sometimes flaring bright green or blue before settling back to normal orange. "Minerals in the wood," Thomas explained, though he didn't sound convinced by his own explanation. Dinner was freeze-dried camping meals heated with water from our bottles. None of us trusted the creek water, despite bringing purification tablets. The food tasted like salted cardboard, but we ate mechanically, driven by the knowledge that we needed calories for warmth. It was during dinner that we heard the first sound. A long, low call echoed through the forest, starting as a whisper and building to something between a howl and a moan. It seemed to come from every direction at once, bouncing off the trees and distorting until it was impossible to identify the source or even the direction. "Coyote," Scott said immediately, but he was gripping his camping fork too tightly. "That didn't sound like any coyote I've ever heard," Jennifer said. She'd moved closer to the fire, though the flames provided more psychological comfort than actual warmth. The sound came again, closer this time, and definitely not a coyote. It had a quality that seemed almost human, but wrong, as if someone was trying to remember how to make human sounds and getting it slightly off. "Mountain lion," Rebecca suggested, but her voice lacked conviction. We sat in silence for several minutes, listening to the forest around us. The normal sounds of night, insects, small animals moving through undergrowth, the settling of trees, were completely absent. There was only the whisper of wind through leaves and the occasional pop of our struggling fire. "I need to use the bathroom," Jennifer announced suddenly, standing up from the log she'd been using as a seat. "Don't go far," Scott warned. "Stay where you can see the fire." She nodded and disappeared into the tree line with a small flashlight. We could track her movement by the bobbing beam of light for about 30 seconds before it vanished behind the trees. That's when we heard her scream. It wasn't the sharp, sudden scream of surprise or fear. It was a long, drawn-out sound of pure terror that seemed to go on forever before cutting off abruptly in the middle. Scott was on his feet before the echo faded, flashlight in hand. "Jennifer! Jennifer!" We all called her name, our voices seeming small and swallowed by the oppressive silence that followed. Scott charged into the trees in the direction she'd gone, with Thomas and Rebecca close behind. I followed, my hand shaking as I tried to work my own flashlight. We found her about 40 yards from camp, standing perfectly still beside a fallen log. Her back was to us, and she didn't respond when Scott called her name. "Jennifer," Rebecca approached cautiously. "Are you okay? We heard you scream." Jennifer turned around slowly, and in the harsh beam of Scott's flashlight, I could see that something was wrong. Her face was completely blank, devoid of any expression. Her eyes were wide open but seemed to be looking through us rather than at us. "I'm fine," she said, and her voice was perfectly normal. Too normal. "I just tripped over this log, startled myself." But I could see the log clearly in the flashlight beam, and it was at least 3 feet away from where she was standing. "You screamed," Thomas said. "We all heard you scream." Jennifer tilted her head slightly like a bird studying something curious. "I don't remember screaming. I'm fine. Should we go back to camp?" We returned to the fire in uncomfortable silence. Jennifer sat down on her log as if nothing had happened, but something was definitely different. She sat too still, blinked too infrequently, and when she smiled, which she did at random intervals, it lasted several seconds too long. "Maybe we should try to get some sleep," Rebecca suggested, though it was barely 8 o'clock. "Big day of hiking tomorrow." Nobody argued. We banked the fire and retreated to our respective tents, though I doubted any of us expected to actually sleep. My tent felt like a paper shell against the darkness outside. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the forest, or rather, the lack of sounds. The silence was so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums. Occasionally, I heard movement from the other tents, the rustle of someone shifting position, a quiet cough from Scott's direction, the whisper of a zipper. But from Jennifer's tent, there was nothing. No movement, no breathing sounds, no indication that anyone was inside at all. I must have dozed, because I was awakened by the sound of someone moving around the campsite. My watch showed 2:30 a.m. I lay still, listening to footsteps circling our cluster of tents. Slow, deliberate steps that seemed to pause at each tent before moving on to the next. I unzipped my tent fly slightly and peered out. In the dim glow of our banked fire, I could see a figure moving between the tents. It was Jennifer, but she was walking strangely, as if she was learning how to use legs for the first time. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, and she kept turning her head at odd angles as if listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. She paused at Scott's tent, standing motionless for nearly a minute before moving on to Thomas's. Then Rebecca's. When she approached my tent, I quickly closed the fly and lay perfectly still, my heart hammering against my ribs. I heard her footsteps stop directly outside my tent. She stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes. I could hear her breathing. Slow, deep breaths that seemed too measured, too controlled. Then she spoke, but not to me. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the absolute silence of the night, every word was clear. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I understand. Tomorrow." Footsteps moved away from my tent, circling the camp once more before stopping. I waited another hour before daring to look outside again. Jennifer was back in her tent, and the campsite appeared normal, but I didn't sleep again that night. Morning brought no relief. The sky above our clearing remained overcast, filtering what little sunlight penetrated the canopy into a gray, oppressive twilight. Our fire had gone out completely, leaving only cold ashes despite Scott's careful banking the night before. Jennifer emerged from her tent looking perfectly normal, if you ignored the fact that she was wearing the exact same clothes she'd worn the day before, down to the positioning of every wrinkle and stain. She smiled at all of us with that too long smile and announced brightly, "What a wonderful night. I slept like the dead." The phrase sent chills down my spine, but nobody else seemed to notice anything unusual. "We should start thinking about hiking back," Scott said, prodding the dead fire with a stick. "Weather's looking rough, and I don't like the feel of this place." "Oh, but we just got here," Jennifer said, her head tilting at that unnatural angle again. "Wouldn't it be a shame to leave so soon? There's so much to explore." Rebecca was studying her map with a frown. "Actually, there's a problem. I can't figure out which way we came in yesterday. Everything looks different." She was right. The forest around our clearing looked completely different from the night before. Trees that I was certain had been on our left when we arrived were now on our right. The creek had somehow moved to the opposite side of the clearing, and the sound of flowing water seemed to come from multiple directions at once. "Maps are tricky in wilderness areas," Jennifer said. Her voice had a sing-song quality that made my skin crawl. "Sometimes they change. Sometimes the land moves. Sometimes what was there yesterday isn't there anymore." Thomas laughed nervously. "Land doesn't move, Jennifer. We're just disoriented." Jennifer turned to look at him, and for just a moment her face went completely blank. Not neutral, blank, as if someone had temporarily vacated her body. When expression returned, she was smiling again. "Of course not, Thomas. How silly of me." We spent 2 hours trying to locate the trail we'd followed in. Every direction looked equally unfamiliar, and our GPS devices were providing contradictory information. According to my phone, we were simultaneously 3 miles east and 2 miles west of our actual location. "We'll have to pick a direction and commit to it," Scott finally announced. "Staying here isn't an option." We packed our gear and chose what Rebecca believed was north, following what might have been a game trail through the dense forest. Jennifer volunteered to take the rear position, insisting she wanted to make sure nobody falls behind. I made sure to stay between her and the rest of the group. The hiking was brutal. The terrain seemed designed to impede our progress, with fallen logs blocking every clear path and thorny undergrowth catching at our clothes and equipment. The temperature continued to drop, and our breath steamed in the increasingly frigid air. After an hour of fighting through the forest, Thomas called for a break. We'd covered maybe half a mile, and he was struggling with his pack and the uneven terrain. "This isn't working," he gasped, leaning against a tree. "We're not even following a real trail." "Just need to push through," Scott said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "We'll hit a marked trail eventually." That's when Jennifer spoke up from behind us. "There's another way." We all turned to look at her. She was standing about 10 feet away, perfectly composed despite the difficult hiking. She wasn't breathing hard, wasn't sweating, showed no signs of exertion at all. "What do you mean?" Rebecca asked. Jennifer's smile widened. "There are paths. Old paths. They know the way out." "They?" Thomas asked. "The ones who've been here longer. They know all the paths." Jennifer gestured vaguely at the forest around us. "They've been watching us. They want to help." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Jennifer, who exactly has been watching us?" She looked at me with those two wide eyes, and for a moment I could swear I saw something else looking back. Something that knew exactly what I was thinking and found it amusing. "The hungry ones," she said simply. "They're always hungry, always watching, always waiting for travelers who lose their way." Scott had gone very pale. "Jennifer, you're scaring people. Let's just focus on finding our way back to civilization." "But that's exactly what I'm trying to help with," Jennifer said, her voice taking on that sing-song quality again. "They showed me the paths last night. While you were all sleeping, they showed me lots of things." She started walking again, but not in the direction we'd been traveling. She headed off at a sharp angle, moving with confident steps through terrain that had been giving the rest of us trouble. "Jennifer, wait!" Rebecca called, but Jennifer didn't stop. If anything, she picked up the pace, moving through the forest with an ease that was completely at odds with her inexperience and oversized pack. Within minutes, she'd disappeared entirely into the trees. "Shit," Scott muttered. "We can't leave her out here alone." "Something's wrong with her," Thomas said quietly. "Something's been wrong since last night." I knew he was right, but what could we do? We followed Jennifer's trail, though it was surprisingly difficult to track. For someone who'd been struggling with basic hiking the day before, she was now moving through the forest without disturbing so much as a broken twig. We followed for nearly an hour before we heard her voice calling back to us. Not calling for help, calling as if she was guiding us somewhere specific. "This way. I found it. I found the path." Her voice seemed to come from multiple directions, echoing strangely through the trees. We followed the sound and found her standing in a small clearing beside what was unmistakably a trail. Not a game trail or a barely visible track, but a clear, well-maintained path marked with stone cairns. "See," Jennifer said triumphantly, "I told you they knew the way." The trail was unlike anything we'd seen in the Cahutta wilderness. The stones forming the cairns were too uniform, too deliberately placed. The path itself was too straight, cutting through the forest in a line that seemed to ignore natural topography entirely. "This has to be an old Cherokee trail," Rebecca said, but she sounded uncertain. "Or maybe something the CCC built back in the 30s. Scott knelt beside one of the cairns, examining the stones. "These aren't local rock," he said slowly. "This is limestone. There shouldn't be any limestone in this part of Georgia." "Does it matter what kind of rocks they are?" Thomas asked. "It's a trail. It has to lead somewhere." Jennifer was already starting down the path, moving with that same unnatural grace. "It leads exactly where we need to go," she called back. "They promised." We had no choice but to follow. The alternative was wandering aimlessly through unmarked forest until we either found our way out or died of exposure. The trail was easy to follow, almost suspiciously so. It maintained a steady, gentle grade that made hiking effortless after the morning's struggle through uneven terrain. The stone markers appeared at regular intervals, and the path was wide enough for us to walk two abreast, but something about it felt wrong. The forest on either side of the trail was too uniform, as if the trees had been planted rather than grown naturally. And despite the easy walking, none of us felt like talking. The path seemed to absorb sound, creating a bubble of unnatural quiet around our small group. Jennifer maintained a position about 20 yards ahead of us, setting a pace that was just slightly too fast for comfort. Every time we started to close the distance, she would somehow drift further ahead without appearing to speed up. "Jennifer," Scott called, "slow down." She turned and waved, but continued walking. When she spoke, her voice carried back to us clearly despite the distance. "Can't slow down," she said. "They're waiting. They've been waiting so long and they're so very hungry." That's when I noticed that her pack was gone. The oversized pink backpack that had been giving her trouble since we started hiking was nowhere to be seen. She was walking completely unburdened, as if she'd never been carrying anything at all. "Where's her pack?" I asked Thomas quietly. He stopped and stared. "Jesus, you're right. When did she lose her pack?" We called ahead to Jennifer, but she either didn't hear us or chose not to respond. She continued down the trail at that too-fast pace, occasionally looking back to make sure we were following. The trail began to descend more steeply, winding down into a narrow valley that shouldn't have existed according to our topographic maps. The trees grew taller and closer together, blocking out what little sky had been visible. The temperature continued to drop, and frost began forming on the vegetation despite the fact that it was only mid-afternoon. "This is wrong," Rebecca said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This whole valley is wrong. It shouldn't be here." Scott had stopped and was studying his GPS device with increasing frustration. "According to this, we're about 2 miles underground," he said. "The elevation readings are completely fucked." "We should turn back," Thomas said. But when we turned around, the trail behind us was gone. Not overgrown, not blocked, simply gone, as if it had never existed. Where the path had been was now a wall of thorny undergrowth so dense it would have been impassable even with machetes. What the hell? Scott pushed at the vegetation, but it was like trying to move a solid wall. Jennifer's voice drifted back to us from ahead, still carrying that strange sing-song quality. Can't go back, never go back, only forward now, only down to where they're waiting. We had no choice but to continue down the trail. The alternative was impossible. Literally impossible, as the forest behind us had become an impenetrable barrier. The descent continued for what felt like hours. My legs began to ache, and the air grew noticeably thinner, though that was impossible at our elevation. The stone cairns became more elaborate as we descended, incorporating carved symbols that hurt to look at directly. Jennifer had stopped near a particularly large cairn about a quarter-mile ahead. She was standing perfectly still, facing something we couldn't see from our position. "Finally," Rebecca said, "maybe she'll wait for us to catch up." But as we got closer, I could see that Jennifer wasn't waiting. She was talking to someone. I could hear her voice, though I couldn't make out the words. The cadence was wrong. Too fast, then too slow, with pauses in places where no pauses should be. "Who is she talking to?" Thomas asked. We were close enough now to see that Jennifer was alone. There was no one else visible near the cairn. But her head was turned as if she was listening to someone, and she occasionally nodded or gestured in response to whatever she was hearing. "Jennifer," Scott called out, "are you okay?" She turned toward us, and the sight made my blood freeze. Her face was wrong. Not obviously different, but wrong in subtle ways that triggered every instinct I had for danger. Her smile was too wide, stretching further than human lips should be able to stretch. Her eyes were too bright, reflecting light like an animal's eyes in headlights. "I'm perfect," she said, and her voice echoed strangely, as if it was coming from somewhere deeper than her throat. "They've been telling me such interesting things. About hunger, about patience, about the taste of fear." That's when I saw the bones. They were scattered around the base of the cairn, partially hidden by dead leaves and undergrowth. Not animal bones. These were too uniform, too familiar. Human bones. Ribs and femurs and what looked like sections of spine, all picked clean and bleached white. "Oh, God," Rebecca whispered. Jennifer's too-wide smile grew even wider. "They've been here for so long, waiting, hungry, but patient, so very patient, and now they don't have to wait anymore." The temperature plummeted. My breath came out in great clouds of vapor, and frost began forming on the bones around the cairn. The forest around us creaked and groaned as if the trees themselves were moving. That's when we heard it. The same sound we'd heard the night before, but much closer and much louder. The long, low call that was almost human but horribly wrong. It came from the forest around us, seeming to originate from multiple sources at once. "Run," Scott said quietly. But there was nowhere to run. The trail behind us was still blocked, and the forest on either side was an impenetrable wall of thorns and twisted trees. The only way was forward, past Jennifer and the cairn of bones, deeper into the valley. "They're coming," Jennifer sang, clapping her hands like a child. "They're so excited. It's been months since they've had fresh meat. They're wondering who they should eat first." The calls were getting closer, and now I could hear movement in the forest. Branches breaking, leaves rustling, and underneath it all, a sound like breathing, but too loud, too deliberate, as if something enormous was drawing breath. "Jennifer, we need to get out of here," Thomas said, his voice shaking. "All of us, together." Jennifer tilted her head at that impossible angle. "But I can't leave. They won't let me. I belong to them now. I promised them a feast, and I always keep my promises." She raised her hand, and I saw that her fingernails had grown. Not just longer, they were now curved, black talons that gleamed like obsidian in the dim light. "I'm sorry," she said. and for just a moment, her voice sounded like the real Jennifer. I tried to fight it, but they were so hungry, and they showed me such wonderful things, such terrible, wonderful things. That's when the first one stepped out of the forest. It had once been human. I could see the basic shape, the bipedal structure, but everything else was wrong. It was too tall, easily 8 feet, with limbs that were too long and joints that bent in directions joints shouldn't bend. Its skin was gray-white, stretched tight over bones that were clearly visible beneath. But the worst part was its face, or what had once been its face. The features were human but distorted, as if someone had tried to sculpt a person from memory and gotten the proportions wrong. Its mouth was too wide, filled with teeth that were too sharp and too numerous. Its eyes were completely black, reflecting no light at all. But most horrifying was the hunger I could see in those black eyes. Not the simple hunger of a predator, but something deeper, more desperate. This thing had been starving for a very long time. "Wendigo," Scott whispered, and I knew he was right. The creature moved with jerky, unnatural motions like a marionette being controlled by someone who wasn't quite sure how joints worked. When it opened its mouth, the sound that came out was the call we'd been hearing, that almost human wail that spoke of endless hunger and desperate need. More shapes moved in the forest around us. I counted at least 3 more of the creatures, possibly more. They stayed just at the edge of visibility, circling our position with predatory patience. Jennifer laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Aren't they beautiful? They used to be like us, you know. Lost hikers, hunters, people who wandered too far from the safe paths. But hunger changes you. Hunger and time and the terrible things you do to stay alive." "How?" Rebecca asked, her voice barely audible. "How is this possible?" "The hunger never stops," Jennifer explained, her talons growing longer as she spoke. "It eats everything else, humanity, sanity, hope, until there's nothing left but the need to feed. They tried to resist at first, but winter is so long in the deep places, and meat is so hard to find." The first Wendigo took a step closer, and I could smell it now. The stench of decay and old blood and something else, something that made my hindbrain scream warnings about death and predation. "But they're clever," Jennifer continued. "They learn to wait, to call, to lead the lost ones down into their valley. And sometimes, when they're very lucky, someone comes back changed, someone who can walk among the living and lead them home." She was talking about herself. Jennifer had become something like them, a lure to draw more victims into their territory. "The hunger is beautiful," she said, her eyes now reflecting light like the creatures around us. "It's pure, honest, no pretense, no social niceties, no insurance policies or quarterly reports, just need and satisfaction." That's when Scott made his move. He pulled out a hunting knife I hadn't known he was carrying and lunged at Jennifer, but she moved faster than anything human should be able to move, stepping aside and raking her talons across his chest in one fluid motion. Scott screamed and stumbled backward, clutching at wounds that were already soaking his shirt with blood. Jennifer licked her talons clean with a tongue that was too long and too dark. "Fresh blood," she purred. "It's been so long since I tasted fresh blood." The Wendigos emerged from the forest, moving with that same unnatural gait. Up close, they were even more horrifying. I could see the remains of human clothing on some of them, a rotted hiking boot, the remnant of a jacket, a tarnished wedding ring on one elongated finger. "Run," Scott gasped, still clutching his chest. "Back up the trail. Maybe we can—" But the trail behind us was still blocked. We were trapped in the narrow valley with creatures that had once been human and one person who was becoming something like them. Thomas was the next to break. He turned and tried to force his way through the thorny undergrowth that blocked our retreat. The thorns tore at his clothes and skin, but he kept pushing, driven by panic and desperation. One of the Wendigos moved to intercept him. Its long arms reached out, grasping Thomas around the waist and lifting him off the ground as if he weighed nothing. Thomas screamed and struggled, but the creature's grip was inexorable. "Please," Thomas begged. "Please, I have a family, I have children." The Wendigo tilted its distorted head, studying Thomas with those black, empty eyes. When it spoke, its voice was like wind through a cemetery. "So, did I?" Then it bit down on Thomas's shoulder and his screams took on a new intensity. The creature didn't kill him quickly. It fed slowly, deliberately, savoring each bite while Thomas thrashed and begged and slowly grew weaker. I turned away, but Rebecca was frozen in horror, watching the feeding with wide, staring eyes. Shock, I realized. She was going into shock. "Rebecca," I said quietly. "Rebecca, we need to move." But there was nowhere to move to. The Wendigos had us surrounded, and Jennifer was blocking the only clear path deeper into the valley. That's when I noticed the side trail. It was barely visible, little more than a deer track leading up the side of the valley wall. But it was there, hidden behind a cluster of fallen logs and thick undergrowth. If we could reach it without being seen. Scott was still bleeding, but he was functional. Rebecca was in shock but could probably be guided if necessary. Thomas was beyond help. The Wendigo was still feeding, making horrible wet sounds as it consumed his flesh. "Scott," I whispered. "Side trail. Uphill. Can you make it?" He followed my gaze and nodded grimly. "Better than staying here." Jennifer was watching the feeding with obvious pleasure, her attention completely focused on the carnage. The other Wendigos were also focused on their feeding companion, perhaps anticipating their own turn. "On 3, I whispered. 1, 2. We ran. I grabbed Rebecca's arm and pulled her along while Scott followed despite his injuries. We crashed through the undergrowth toward the hidden trail, making far too much noise but hoping the sounds of Thomas's death would cover our escape. Jennifer's head snapped around as soon as we moved. Her face contorted with rage, and she let out a shriek that was purely inhuman. The feeding Wendigo looked up from Thomas's corpse, its muzzle dripping with blood, and the others began moving toward us with frightening speed. The side trail was steeper than it had looked, basically a vertical climb up the valley wall. Scott was struggling with his injuries, and Rebecca was moving like a sleepwalker, but adrenaline and terror drove us upward. Below us, Jennifer and the Wendigos reached the base of the trail. Jennifer began climbing with inhuman agility, her talons finding purchase on rock faces that should have been impossible to scale. The Wendigos were slower but no less determined, their elongated limbs allowing them to cover surprising amounts of ground with each movement. "Faster," Scott gasped. "They're gaining." The trail switchbacked up the valley wall following a route that was probably used by deer or other wildlife. It was narrow, treacherous, and made even more dangerous by the frost that had formed on every surface. One slip would send us tumbling back down into the waiting claws of our pursuers. Rebecca stumbled and nearly fell, but I caught her arm and pulled her upright. She was muttering something under her breath, the same words over and over, like a mantra or a prayer. "Not real, not real, not real," she repeated. "This isn't happening. This isn't real." Jennifer's voice echoed up from below, distorted by the strange acoustics of the valley. "You can't escape. The hunger follows. The hunger always follows." The trail leveled out as we reached the rim of the valley, emerging into what looked like normal Georgia forest. The temperature was noticeably warmer, and I could see actual sky through the canopy above. More importantly, I could see blazes on the trees, white paint marks indicating an official trail. "This way," Scott said, pointing toward a clear path marked with the standard trail signs. "This has to connect to the main trail system." We ran along the marked trail, putting as much distance as possible between ourselves and the valley. Behind us, I could hear Jennifer's frustrated shrieks and the crashing of branches as the Wendigos tried to follow our route up the cliff face. But they were falling behind. Whatever power allowed them to exist in their hidden valley didn't seem to extend to the normal forest above. Their calls grew more distant, more mournful, until they faded entirely. We ran for 2 hours before exhaustion finally forced us to stop. Scott's injuries were worse than I'd initially thought. The gashes across his chest were deep and still bleeding. Rebecca had come out of her shock but was shaking uncontrollably, whether from cold or trauma or both. "We need to find help," I said, studying Scott's wounds. "These need medical attention." "Radio tower," Scott said weakly, pointing ahead. "Saw it through the trees. Might be able to get cell service." He was right. About a quarter-mile ahead, I could see the metal framework of a communication tower rising above the tree line. We helped each other reach the small clearing at its base, where a maintenance shed and gravel access road indicated contact with civilization. My phone showed 3 bars of signal. I called 911, then Park Services, then anyone else I could think of. Within an hour, we heard the sound of helicopters, and search and rescue teams were rappelling into the clearing. The next several hours were a blur of medical treatment, police interviews, and official reports. Scott was airlifted to a hospital in Atlanta, where surgeons worked for 6 hours to repair the damage Jennifer's talons had inflicted. Rebecca was treated for shock and exposure. The official report listed Thomas Davis and Jennifer Williams as missing hikers, presumed lost in the Cahutta wilderness. Despite extensive searches involving multiple agencies and volunteer groups, no trace of either person was ever found. The search teams never located the valley where we'd encountered the Wendigos, despite my detailed descriptions and GPS coordinates that should have led them directly to the site. The investigators were professional and thorough, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes when I described what had really happened. Wild animal attack, they concluded. Possibly a bear. Shock and trauma had caused me to imagine the more fantastic elements. Rebecca never spoke about what she'd seen. After 3 days in the hospital, she took a leave of absence from work and moved back to her hometown in Ohio. We exchanged a few emails, but neither of us was eager to revisit the events of that weekend. Scott recovered physically, though the scars across his chest served as a permanent reminder of our encounter. He quit his job 6 months later and moved to Arizona, as far from Georgia forests as he could get. I tried to return to normal life, but normal had been redefined. I couldn't look at forests without wondering what might be hiding in their depths. I couldn't hear wind through trees without remembering that almost human call that spoke of endless hunger. 3 months after our ordeal, I received a package in the mail. No return address, postmarked from a small town in North Georgia I'd never heard of. Inside was a single photograph. A family of 4 posed beside their SUV at what looked like a trailhead parking area. A husband, wife, and 2 young children, all dressed for hiking and smiling at the camera. On the back of the photograph, written in familiar handwriting, was a message. "They're so excited about their camping trip. It's been too long since the children had fresh meat. Thanks for the recommendation about the Cahutta wilderness. J." I burned the photograph, but I couldn't burn the knowledge of what it meant. Jennifer was still out there, still leading people into that hidden valley where hunger ruled and humanity went to die. I've thought about contacting the authorities, but what would I tell them? That a woman, officially listed as missing, was actually a monster recruiting victims for a pack of Wendigos living in a valley that doesn't appear on any map. Instead, I've made it my mission to watch. I monitor hiking forums, social media posts, anything that might indicate people are planning trips to remote areas of North Georgia. When I find someone asking about authentic wilderness experiences or secluded camping areas, I try to steer them toward safer alternatives. Sometimes I'm too late. Sometimes I see missing person reports that match the pattern. Hikers who vanished without a trace in the Cahutta wilderness or surrounding areas. No bodies ever found. No evidence of what happened to them. But I know. The hunger is still there, waiting in its hidden valley. Patient, eternal, always ready to welcome new visitors who've wandered too far from the safe paths. And somewhere in those mountains, Jennifer is still smiling her too wide smile, leading the lost ones home. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Cahutta wilderness of North Georgia, deep in the Chattahoochee National Forest, where the mountains swallow screams and the trees remember things better left forgotten. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. Just me, my college roommate David Jones, and our friend from work, Kevin King. We'd planned this trip for months, needing to escape the suffocating routine of our accounting firm in Atlanta. The Cahutta wilderness promised isolation, pristine hiking trails, and a chance to reconnect with something primal that our cubicle lives had slowly strangled. David had done most of the planning. He was always the organized one, the guy who read trail guides cover to cover and packed emergency supplies we'd probably never need. Kevin was our comic relief, the kind of guy who could find humor in a funeral. As for me, I was just desperate to get away from the fluorescent lights and spreadsheets that had been slowly eating away at my sanity. We drove up on a Friday evening in October, when the leaves were bleeding crimson and gold across the mountainsides. The temperature was dropping faster than the weather service predicted, and by the time we reached the trailhead near Dyer Gap, our breath was visible in the dying light. "Jesus, it's colder than I expected," Kevin muttered, shouldering his pack. "Good thing David packed enough gear for a polar expedition." David just smiled, adjusting his GPS unit. "Better safe than sorry. Weather can change fast up here." The plan was simple. Hike 3 miles to Tearbridge's Creek, set up camp, then spend Saturday exploring the backcountry before heading home Sunday afternoon. The trail started easy enough, winding through dense hardwood forest with occasional glimpses of distant peaks through the canopy. But even in those first few minutes, something felt off. The forest was too quiet. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just the crunch of our boots on fallen leaves and the whisper of wind through bare branches. It was the kind of silence that makes you want to whisper, as if speaking too loudly might wake something better left sleeping. "Anyone else notice how quiet it is?" I asked as we paused to check our bearings. David looked up from his GPS, frowning. "Yeah, actually. Could be the weather front moving in." Kevin laughed, but it sounded forced. "What are you guys, scared of a little peace and quiet? This is exactly what we came for." As daylight faded, we switched on our headlamps. The beams carved narrow tunnels through the darkness, creating a claustrophobic bubble of visibility that made the surrounding forest feel like a living, breathing entity pressing in on all sides. Every shadow beyond our lights seemed to shift and writhe with malevolent intent. We reached our planned campsite around 8 p.m., a small clearing beside Tearbridge's Creek. The sound of running water should have been comforting, but instead it felt like nature was whispering secrets we weren't meant to hear. David immediately set about establishing camp with military precision, while Kevin gathered firewood. I started filtering water from the creek, trying to shake the growing unease that had been building since we left the trailhead. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, almost masked by the earthy scent of damp leaves and rich soil. But as I knelt by the creek, filling our water bottles, it became unmistakable. The sweet, cloying stench of something dead and rotting. "Hey guys," I called softly, not wanting my voice to carry too far into the darkness. "You smell that?" David stopped pitching his tent. Kevin emerged from the tree line with an armload of deadwood. Both sniffed the air. "Probably just a dead deer somewhere," David said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Animals die in the woods all the time." Kevin dropped his wood near our designated fire pit. "Smells stronger than any dead deer I've ever encountered. More like—" He paused, wrinkling his nose. "More like something's been rotting for weeks." We decided to move our camp about 50 yards upstream, but the smell followed us like an invisible predator. As we set up our tents in the new location, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I turned around expecting to catch a glimpse of eyes reflecting our firelight, I saw only darkness. David got a fire going just as the temperature began to plummet. We huddled around the flames, cooking our freeze-dried meals and trying to pretend everything was normal. But normal was becoming a foreign concept. "GPS is acting weird," David announced, staring at his unit with confusion. "It keeps showing our location in different spots, like we're moving even though we're sitting still." I pulled out my phone to check our position, but the screen was dead. "That's strange. My phone was at full battery when we started hiking." Kevin checked his phone and cursed. "Mine's dead too. What are the odds of all our electronics failing at once?" "Probably just the cold," David said, but he didn't sound convinced. He tried his GPS again, shaking it like that might fix whatever was wrong. "This thing is showing us in at least 3 different locations, and none of them make sense." The fire began to behave strangely too. Instead of the steady orange flames we'd enjoyed earlier, it started flickering between colors: blue, green, purple, like it was burning some kind of chemical accelerant. But we'd only used regular firewood and paper kindling. "What the hell is that about?" Kevin asked, poking at the fire with a stick. The flames briefly flared normal orange before shifting back to an unsettling blue-green. "Could be minerals in the wood," I suggested, but even as I said it, I knew that wasn't right. These were ordinary hardwood branches, nothing that should burn in such an unnatural spectrum. We tried to maintain normal conversation, talking about work, sports, anything to fill the oppressive silence that pressed against our small circle of light. But our words felt hollow, swallowed by the darkness beyond our fire. Around 11 p.m., exhaustion finally overcame our unease. We banked the fire and retreated to our tents. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the creek's constant murmur and trying to ignore the fact that every sound seemed amplified in the darkness. A twig snapping 50 yards away sounded like a gunshot. The wind through the trees created whispers that almost sounded like voices. Sleep came in fragments, broken by moments of heart-pounding awareness when some indefinable noise would jolt me awake. Each time, I'd lie perfectly still, straining to identify what had disturbed me, but hearing only the creek and my own thundering pulse. Sometime deep in the night, I was awakened by a sound that didn't belong, a low, guttural moaning that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It started soft, almost like wind through a canyon, but gradually grew louder and more distinctly human. I unzipped my tent flap just enough to peer out. The fire had died to glowing embers, casting barely enough light to make out the shapes of my friends' tents. Everything appeared normal, but the moaning continued, seeming to circle our campsite like a predator testing for weakness. "David?" I whispered. "Kevin? You guys awake?" No response. The moaning stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete it felt like the world had stopped breathing. I grabbed my flashlight and crawled out of my tent, every nerve screaming that this was a terrible idea. The beam of my light revealed our campsite exactly as we'd left it, but something was wrong. The air itself felt different, thicker, more oppressive, like the moments before a severe thunderstorm. That's when I realized what was bothering me. David's tent was too quiet. I couldn't hear his breathing, couldn't detect any movement or shifting that would indicate someone sleeping inside. "David?" I called a little louder, approaching his tent. The silence stretched until I couldn't stand it anymore. I reached for his tent zipper and slowly pulled it down, my flashlight beam revealing an empty sleeping bag. But the bag was unzipped from the inside, as if David had gotten out voluntarily. Panic began to build in my chest as I checked Kevin's tent. Also empty. Also unzipped from within. I was alone in the middle of the Cahutta wilderness, surrounded by hundreds of thousands of acres of untamed forest, with no idea where my friends had gone or why they'd left without waking me. "David! Kevin!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the trees. "Where are you?" The only response was the creek's indifferent babble and the whisper of wind through bare branches. I spent the next hour searching our immediate area, calling their names until my throat was raw. My flashlight revealed no signs of struggle, no indication of what might have happened. Their boots were still in their tents, along with their jackets and most of their gear. They'd apparently wandered into the wilderness in their sleep clothes and socks. As dawn approached, I sat by the rekindled fire, trying to make sense of the situation. Maybe they'd heard something and gone to investigate. Maybe they'd gotten disoriented in the dark and were trying to find their way back. Maybe there was a perfectly logical explanation that would become clear in daylight. But deep down, I knew something terrible had happened. When the sun finally rose, painting the forest in shades of gold and amber, I began a systematic search. I found their tracks leading away from camp, but they were strange, overlapping and confused, like my friends had been walking in circles or following some invisible path that made no sense. The tracks led me deeper into the wilderness, away from any established trail. I followed them for what felt like hours, growing more disoriented with each step. The forest seemed to shift around me, paths appearing and disappearing. Landmarks I'd noted earlier nowhere to be found when I tried to use them for navigation. By afternoon, I was completely lost. That's when I saw David. He was standing about 100 yards away, perfectly still between two massive oak trees. Relief flooded through me as I called his name and ran toward him. But as I got closer, something made me slow down. David wasn't responding to my calls. He stood with his back to me, motionless as a statue, and something about his posture seemed wrong. Too straight, too rigid, like someone trying very hard to appear human. "David," I called softly as I approached, "are you okay? What happened last night?" He turned around slowly and I nearly screamed. It was David's face, but not David's eyes. Where my friend's warm brown eyes should have been, there were holes, not wounds, just empty sockets that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and when he smiled, his teeth appeared longer and sharper than they should have been. "Michael," he said in David's voice, but wrong somehow, like an echo of an echo. "I've been waiting for you." I took a step backward, every instinct screaming that this wasn't my friend. "What happened to you? Where's Kevin?" "Kevin's fine," the thing wearing David's face replied. "He's waiting for us. We have something to show you." It started walking toward me with jerky, unnatural movements, like a marionette controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. I turned and ran. Behind me, I heard laughter that started in David's voice but gradually shifted into something else, something that had never been human. I crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and skin, driven by pure terror. The laughter followed me, seeming to come from every direction at once. Sometimes it sounded like David, sometimes like Kevin, sometimes like voices I'd never heard before. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, collapsing against a massive fallen log. As I gasped for breath, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. It couldn't have been David. David was probably injured somewhere, maybe concussed, and my panic-addled brain had distorted what I'd observed. But those empty eye sockets. A twig snapped behind me, and I spun around to see Kevin emerging from the trees. Like David, something was fundamentally wrong with him. His movements were too fluid, too graceful, like he was floating just above the ground. And his smile was too wide, stretching from ear to ear in a way that should have split his face. "Michael," Kevin said in his familiar voice, but with an undertone that made my skin crawl. "Why did you run from David? We just want to help you." "Help me with what?" I managed to whisper. "Understanding?" Kevin replied, tilting his head at an impossible angle. "There are things in these woods older than the trees, older than the mountains themselves. They've been hungry for so long." I scrambled over the fallen log and ran again, Kevin's laughter mixing with David's in a horrible symphony that seemed to follow me no matter which direction I went. The forest had become a maze designed specifically to trap me. Every path I took led me in circles. Every landmark I tried to use for navigation shifted when I wasn't looking directly at it. The sun seemed to move randomly across the sky, making it impossible to determine direction or time. As evening approached, I found myself back at what looked like our original campsite. But everything was wrong. Our tents were there, but they were arranged differently. The fire pit was in the wrong location. Even the creek seemed to be flowing in the opposite direction. David and Kevin were waiting for me, sitting by a fire that burned with those same unnatural colors I'd seen the night before. They looked normal now, my friends exactly as they should appear, but I knew better. "Michael," David called out cheerfully. "There you are. We were worried sick when we woke up and found you missing." Kevin nodded enthusiastically. "We've been searching for you all day. What happened? Did you sleepwalk or something?" For a moment, I almost believed them. The relief of seeing my friends apparently safe and normal was overwhelming. But then I noticed their eyes. David's were the wrong color, blue instead of brown. Kevin's were brown instead of blue. Someone had gotten the details wrong. "I saw you earlier," I said carefully, staying outside their circle of firelight. "David, you were standing in the woods. Your eyes." "I think you're suffering from exposure," David said with concern. "You're talking nonsense. My eyes are fine, see?" He looked directly at me and his eyes were the correct brown now, but there was something predatory in his gaze. "Come sit by the fire," Kevin urged. "You must be freezing. We found some great shelter spots for tonight." Every instinct told me to run, but I was exhausted, lost, and beginning to doubt my own perceptions. Maybe I was suffering from exposure. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I approached the fire cautiously and sat down across from them. Up close, they seemed perfectly normal, my friends as they'd always been. But the smell was back, that cloying sweetness of advanced decay, stronger than ever. "Where did you guys go last night?" I asked. They exchanged glances. "We never left," David said. "You're the one who wandered off. We woke up around 3 a.m. and you were gone. Your tents were empty. Your sleeping bags were unzipped from the inside." Kevin laughed. "That's impossible. We were here all night. I think you're more disoriented than you realize." They seemed so genuine, so concerned, that I began to question everything I'd experienced. Had I really seen David with empty eye sockets? Had Kevin really moved like he was floating? Maybe my mind was fracturing under the stress of being lost and afraid. We cooked dinner, more freeze-dried meals that tasted like cardboard, and tried to plan our route out of the wilderness for the next morning. David's GPS was working perfectly now, showing our exact location with precision. Our phones had mysteriously regained their charge, but as the evening progressed, small details continued to bother me. David kept forgetting things. The name of our supervisor at work, the restaurant where we'd celebrated Kevin's birthday last month, the college we'd all attended. Kevin laughed at the wrong times and told jokes that made no sense. When David got up to relieve himself, I watched him walk into the darkness beyond our firelight. His shadow, cast by the flames, didn't match his movements. While David walked normally away from the fire, his shadow moved with that same jerky, marionette-like motion I'd witnessed earlier. Terror crept back into my chest as I realized the truth. These weren't my friends. They were something else, something that had studied David and Kevin closely enough to mimic them, but couldn't quite get all the details right. I needed to get away, but I had to be smart about it. Whatever these things were, they were playing a game with me, and running blindly into the forest again would only delay the inevitable. "I'm pretty beat," I announced, standing and stretching. "Think I'll turn in early." "Good idea," Kevin replied. "Tomorrow we'll get you back to civilization and get you checked out by a doctor." I retreated to my tent, but instead of settling in for the night, I quietly gathered my essential gear: flashlight, knife, water, energy bars. Then I used my knife to cut a small slit in the back of my tent, creating an escape route invisible from the fire. I waited until I heard David and Kevin talking quietly by the fire, their voices carrying that strange echo quality that marked them as imposters. Then I slipped out through my makeshift exit and into the darkness. This time, I moved carefully and quietly, using every hunting skill my grandfather had taught me as a child. I picked my way through the forest like a ghost, avoiding twigs and leaves that might snap or rustle underfoot. Behind me, I heard one of the things call my name, but I didn't look back. I walked through the night, using the stars for navigation when they were visible through the canopy. My grandfather had always said that if you were truly lost, the best strategy was to follow water downstream. It would eventually lead to civilization. The creek became my guide, its sound masking my movement as I followed its winding path through the wilderness. Every shadow could hide one of those things wearing my friends' faces, every sound could signal their approach. As dawn broke, I realized I could smell something different. Wood smoke, but not from a campfire. This was from a chimney, the kind of smoke that meant people and safety. Following the scent, I emerged from the forest into a small clearing where a ramshackle cabin sat beside the creek. Smoke drifted from its stone chimney, and warm light glowed in the windows. I approached cautiously, but before I could knock, the door opened to reveal an elderly man with wild gray hair and suspicious eyes. "You're the one they're looking for," he said without preamble. "Who's looking for me?" "The things wearing your friends' faces. They've been through here twice since midnight, asking if I'd seen a lost hiker." His eyes were sharp and intelligent despite his disheveled appearance. "Name's Ezra Whitman. Been living up here for 30 years, and I know a skinwalker when I see one." Skinwalker? The word hit me like a physical blow. My grandfather had told me stories about such creatures, native legends about evil shamans who could steal the appearance of others. But those were just stories, weren't they? "They killed your friends," Ezra continued matter-of-factly. "Probably sometime after midnight that first night. Skinwalkers need time to study their victims, to learn how to mimic them properly. That's why the details were wrong when you saw them again." "How do you know all this?" "Because it's happened before. Every few years, hikers go missing in these woods. Sometimes their friends make it out alive, telling stories about their companions acting strange. Most folks think it's just trauma or exposure, but I know better." Ezra invited me inside his cabin, which was cramped but warm. The walls were covered with what looked like protective symbols carved into the wood. Crosses, pentacles, strange geometric patterns I didn't recognize. "The skinwalkers can't cross these wards," he explained, noticing my stare. "But they can wait. They're patient creatures. How do I get out of here? That's the problem. They know these woods better than any human ever could. They'll hunt you until you drop from exhaustion, then take your form too." Ezra poured coffee from a battered pot and handed me a cup, but there might be another way. He told me about an old Cherokee legend, that skinwalkers could be destroyed if you could force them to reveal their true form and then burned their stolen skins. The trick was making them angry enough to drop their human disguise. "The skins will be hidden somewhere they feel safe," Ezra explained. "Probably back at your original campsite, buried or stashed in a tree. If you can find them and burn them, the creatures will be trapped in whatever form they're wearing when the skins are destroyed." "And if I can't find the skins?" Ezra's expression was grim. "Then you die here, and 3 skinwalkers leave these mountains instead of 2. He gave me an old hunting rifle and a box of shells, along with a bottle of clear liquid that smelled like rubbing alcohol. "Moonshine with a little something extra mixed in," he said. "Douse the skins with this and they'll burn, even when wet." I spent the day resting and planning. As evening approached, Ezra confirmed what I'd suspected. The things wearing my friends' faces had returned, circling his cabin at a respectful distance from his protective wards. "They know you're here," he said, peering through a gap in his curtains. "Question is, are you brave enough to finish this?" As full darkness fell, I slipped out the back of Ezra's cabin and began the most terrifying journey of my life. I had to return to our original campsite, find where the skinwalkers had hidden their stolen skins, and destroy them before the creatures realized what I was doing. The walk back took hours, every step filled with the certainty that I was being watched and followed. Twice I saw David and Kevin moving through the trees parallel to my path, but they kept their distance, apparently confident that I was trapped regardless. I reached our campsite around midnight. It looked exactly as we'd left it that first night, down to the cold ashes in our fire pit. But now I could see things I'd missed before. Scratches on tree bark too high and too deep to have been made by any normal animal, and a smell beneath the usual forest scents that reminded me of wet dog and sulfur. I began my search systematically, looking for any sign of recently disturbed earth or unusual hiding spots. The skinwalkers would have needed to conceal the skins somewhere safe but accessible. I found them buried beneath a fallen log about 50 yards from our campsite. 3 bundles wrapped in what looked like oilcloth, each containing what appeared to be human skin that had been carefully preserved and treated like leather. The sight of them made me vomit violently. These weren't just skins. They were my friends, reduced to disguises for monsters that had murdered them in ways I couldn't begin to imagine. With shaking hands, I doused the bundles with Ezra's moonshine mixture and struck a match. The skins burned with flames that danced between blue and green, releasing a stench so vile it made the earlier rotting smell seem pleasant by comparison. As they burned, I heard screaming from the forest. Not human screams, but something much worse. David and Kevin came crashing through the underbrush, but they weren't trying to maintain their human appearances anymore. Their faces were shifting and melting, revealing glimpses of something underneath that my mind refused to fully process. "You don't understand what you've done," the thing that had been Kevin shrieked in a voice like breaking glass. They rushed toward me with inhuman speed, but as the last of the skins crumbled to ash, both creatures suddenly froze. Their stolen faces fell away entirely, revealing the skinwalkers' true forms: gaunt, elongated figures with too many joints and eyes like black holes in reality. Then they began to dissolve, their bodies turning to smoke and shadow that scattered on the wind, with sounds like distant screaming. I stood alone in the forest, surrounded by the ashes of my friends' remains, and finally understood the full horror of what had happened. The walk out of the Cahutta wilderness took me 2 days. I followed the creek downstream until I reached a Forest Service road, then flagged down a park ranger who was checking campsites. The official report stated that David Jones and Kevin King had fallen victim to exposure and wild animal predation, their remains scattered too widely for recovery. I was treated for hypothermia and mild dehydration, then released after a psychological evaluation that concluded I was suffering from survivor's guilt and trauma-induced hallucinations. I never tried to correct the official story. Who would believe the truth? But sometimes, late at night in my apartment back in Atlanta, I hear scratching at my windows and catch glimpses of familiar faces in my peripheral vision. David and Kevin, standing just outside my field of view, waiting with infinite patience for me to let my guard down. Because that's the thing about skinwalkers that Ezra didn't tell me until it was too late. Destroying their stolen skins doesn't kill them. It just makes them very, very angry. And now they know where I live.